Somewhere on the northern coast of Africa, in the year 146 BC, a city is burning. Not slowly, not quietly, but with the kind of fire that takes days to die, that can be seen from ships miles out at sea, that fills the lungs of everyone for miles around, with the smell of ash and melting bronze and something older and harder to name, the smell of a world being unmade. Carthage is burning, and Rome put the match to it. What you're about to hear is one of the most haunting stories in all of ancient history. Not just a battle, not just a siege, not just one empire defeating another. Something rarer and more troubling than that. The deliberate, methodical erasure of an entire civilization. A city that had stood for 6 centuries, that had sent ships to the edge of the known world, that had raised temples and written libraries and buried its dead with ceremony and grief, was systematically taken apart, street by street, stone by stone, until almost nothing remained. The Romans didn't just defeat Carthage, they decided it should never have existed at all. That raises a question that historians have been turning over ever since. How does something like that happen? How does a rivalry between 2 civilizations end not in conquest, not in occupation, not even in the usual brutal terms of ancient warfare, but in something closer to annihilation? How do you get from 2 trading powers sharing a Mediterranean world to one of them spending 17 days making sure the other one simply ceases to exist? That's what this story is really about. Not just the siege, not just the fire, but the long, complicated road that led there. The choices made, the opportunities missed, the political forces and personal ambitions and ancient grievances that accumulated over more than a century until the destruction of Carthage felt, to enough Romans, not like a crime, but like a necessity. We'll follow that road together tonight, and if you're listening to this right now in the dark or half asleep with the video playing on your phone, I want you to know that's exactly the spirit in which this was made. These are the kinds of stories that reward a slow and unhurried mind. You don't have to hold on to every name and date. Just let the picture build. Let the world of Carthage take shape around you, because that's the first thing you need to understand. Carthage was not simply an enemy city. It was the centre of something vast, a maritime civilization that stretched across the western Mediterranean and beyond, a culture with its own gods, its own language, its own art and architecture and way of organising a life. When Rome finally finished with it in 146 BC, it didn't just destroy a city. It destroyed a world that had been centuries in the making, a world that connected the coasts of North Africa to Spain, to Sardinia, to Sicily, to trading posts so remote that their exact locations are still debated by scholars today. That world is mostly gone now, largely because Rome made it gone. The records were burned, the libraries lost, the language slowly faded from use until it survived only in fragments and inscriptions, and the echoes that researchers are still piecing together. Almost everything we know about Carthage we know through Roman eyes, which is a little like reading a trial transcript written entirely by the prosecution. So we'll try to do something different here. We'll try to see Carthage as it was before the fire as a living place with all the texture and complexity that implies. We'll meet the people who built it and the people who defended it to the very end. We'll follow the politics and the wars and the strange, slow logic that made destruction seem inevitable to those who carried it out. But first, just for a moment, hold that image. A city on a hill above a harbour, the light off the Mediterranean catching the white buildings, smoke beginning to rise in the distance, 600 years of history about to end in 17 days. Before we go any further, I'm curious where you are right now as you listen to this. What time is it? Are you in bed with the lights off somewhere between waking and sleep? Are you on the other side of the world at a strange hour when everything feels quieter than it should? I always read the comments, and there is something genuinely moving about the idea that people from so many different places and time zones drift off together to the same stories about the ancient world. Leave a comment and let me know, and then let's go back to the beginning, back across the sea to where Carthage began. To understand Carthage, you have to go back further still, back across the Mediterranean to a narrow strip of coastline in what we now call Lebanon and northern Israel, where, sometime around 1200 BC, something remarkable was happening. The great Bronze Age empires were collapsing, Egypt was weakening, the Hittites were gone, Mycenaean Greece had fallen into its dark age, the entire eastern Mediterranean looked like it was unravelling, and into that vacuum stepped a people the Greeks would call the Phoenicians. We don't know exactly what they called themselves. The name Phoenician is borrowed from the outside, possibly from the Greek word for purple, a reference to the famous dye that these coastal cities produced from sea snails, a dye so rare and labour-intensive that it became the colour of kings across the ancient world. What we know is that they lived in a cluster of prosperous city-states, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, places that looked out toward the sea and understood, earlier than almost anyone, what the sea could offer. They weren't empire builders in the traditional sense. They didn't field massive armies or conquer territory by force. What they did instead was something arguably more durable. They built ships, and they sailed them everywhere, and they traded. Phoenician merchants were among the most sophisticated navigators of the ancient world. They understood currents and wind patterns, and the positions of stars in ways that let them sail routes other people were afraid to attempt. They carried glass and purple cloth and worked metal and cedar wood. They brought back silver and tin and grain and stories of places so distant they seemed like invention. And wherever they found a useful harbour, a sheltered bay, a headland with fresh water nearby, they planted a settlement, not always a full colony. Sometimes just a trading post, a place to resupply and winter over. But over generations, some of those outposts became cities. Carthage was one of them. The founding tradition, and we should hold it loosely because origin stories have a way of polishing themselves over centuries, tells of a Phoenician princess named Elissa, known to the Romans as Dido, who fled the city of Tyre around the 9th century BC after a succession struggle turned violent. She sailed west with followers, landed on the coast of what is now Tunisia, and founded a new city. The name Carthage likely derives from the Phoenician words for new city, Gart-Hadasht, a beginning written into the name itself. What made the location extraordinary was not obvious at first glance. The site was a peninsula jutting into the Gulf of Tunis, with a natural harbour on one side and a saltwater lagoon on the other. That double waterfront would eventually be developed into one of the most sophisticated port systems the ancient world had ever seen. But even before those later engineering works, the geography made sense. The peninsula was defensible. Ships could be sheltered on multiple sides depending on weather. And the surrounding land, the hinterland that stretched back from the coast, was genuinely fertile. Not the thin, exhausted soil of parts of the Mediterranean basin, but rich agricultural land capable of supporting grain and olives and orchards on a serious scale. Carthage was positioned, almost perfectly, at the intersection of two kinds of wealth: the sea routes that connected east to west across the Mediterranean, and the agricultural and mineral resources of North Africa. In time, the city would develop both of those advantages with extraordinary ambition. The Phoenician cultural inheritance ran deep in Carthaginian identity. The language, which scholars call Punic in its later Western form, was rooted in Phoenician. The alphabet, one of the great intellectual gifts of the ancient world, the ancestor of the Greek alphabet, and ultimately of the one you're reading in right now, came down through that same tradition. The gods worshipped at Carthage, most prominently Baal-Hamon and Tanit, reflected Phoenician religious practice, adapted and deepened over centuries, and crucially, the maritime orientation never faded. Carthage looked at the Western Mediterranean the way its Phoenician ancestors had looked at the Eastern, as a network waiting to be built. Over the following centuries, Carthaginian merchants and settlers established outposts along the North African coast, in western Sicily, in Sardinia, in the Balearic Islands, along the southern coast of Spain. Each new port was a node in a web of commerce and influence that had no real rival in the Western Mediterranean for hundreds of years. Long before Rome was anything more than a cluster of villages on 7 hills above the Tiber, Carthage was already old, already powerful, already the centre of a world. Walk into Carthage at its height, and you're walking into something that would have stopped you cold. Not because of monuments, though there were monuments, not because of temples or walls, though those were impressive enough. What would have stopped you was the noise and the smell and the sheer velocity of commerce, the sense that you had arrived at a place where the whole Mediterranean was converging, where the products of a dozen different civilizations were being sorted and priced and loaded and sold, where everything was moving and everyone had somewhere to be. The harbours were the heart of it. Ancient writers describe a port arrangement that was almost certainly unique in the ancient world. The commercial harbour, where merchant vessels arrived and departed in a constant stream, connected to a military harbour that could house something in the range of 200 warships in covered berths arranged in a circular pattern around a central island. Whether those specific numbers are exact is a question worth holding loosely, but the engineering ambition they suggest is entirely consistent with what archaeology has confirmed. Carthage didn't just use the sea, it organised the sea. It built infrastructure around maritime power the way later civilizations would build roads. Behind those harbours stretched the workshops and warehouses that made the whole system function. Craftsmen working in metals, bronze and iron, and the silver and gold that came up through trade networks from the interior of Africa and the mines of Spain. Weavers producing textiles that would be sold from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. And then there was the dye industry, that deep Phoenician inheritance, the extraction of purple from murex snails in quantities that required enormous labour and enormous patience. Because the colour didn't come cheaply or quickly, but it commanded prices that made the effort worthwhile many times over. Roman senators wore purple trim. Persian kings wore it. Wherever you found wealth and power in the ancient world, you found this colour, and much of it traced back directly or indirectly to Phoenician and Punic production. The markets themselves would have been extraordinary places to stand. Grain from the Carthaginian agricultural territories, tin from Britain moving through Spanish intermediaries, copper from Cyprus and Sardinia, hides and ivory and gold dust filtering north from sub-Saharan Africa, along routes that Carthaginian merchants were among the first Mediterranean people to develop systematically. There is an account, preserved in fragments, of a Carthaginian explorer named Hanno, who sailed down the Atlantic coast of Africa, possibly as far as modern Cameroon or Gabon, cataloguing coastlines and peoples and resources. We can argue about exactly where he went and exactly when, but the text survives, and what it tells us is that Carthage was not content with the Mediterranean. It was probing further, always looking for the next edge. What made this commercial empire function was something more abstract but equally important. Carthage developed financial and contractual institutions sophisticated enough to underpin long-distance trade at scale. Multi-party business arrangements, partnerships that spread the risk of voyages across several investors so that no single merchant was ruined by a single shipwreck. Systems for extending credit, mechanisms for settling disputes. The ancient sources are frustratingly thin on the specific details, but the evidence of the trade itself demands sophisticated infrastructure behind it. You don't maintain a commercial network stretching from the Atlantic to Libya to the Eastern Mediterranean on handshakes alone. There was also the military dimension of this wealth, and Carthage navigated that balance in ways that set it apart from most ancient powers. Carthaginian citizens tended not to serve in the infantry themselves, at least not in the great campaigns. Instead, the city hired mercenaries, drawing fighters from Iberia, Gaul, the Balearic Islands, Numidia, Libya, and elsewhere, specialists in their own forms of combat. Numidian cavalry that could outmaneuver almost anything in the ancient world. Balearic slingers whose accuracy was terrifying at range. This wasn't weakness. It was a calculated choice by a civilization that understood its comparative advantages. Why send your merchants and craftsmen to die in Sicilian campaigns when you could pay soldiers to fight for you and return to making money in the meantime? The system worked when commanders were competent, when pay arrived on time, when the mercenaries trusted the city that employed them. When those conditions broke down, as they occasionally did, the results were catastrophic. But for centuries the formula held. The agricultural foundations of Carthaginian wealth deserve more attention than they usually receive. The city wasn't only a maritime trading hub. Behind it stretched territories of genuinely productive farmland, work through arrangements that range from large estates owned by Carthaginian aristocratic families to smaller holdings and tenant farming arrangements. Carthaginian writers produced agricultural manuals, and one of them, a man named Mago, wrote a text on farming that the Romans considered authoritative enough to have translated into Latin after they'd destroyed the city. Think about that for a moment. Rome demolished Carthage with deliberate thoroughness, and then preserved its farming knowledge. Mago's work covered olive cultivation, viticulture, animal husbandry, and grain production in detail that reflected centuries of accumulated practice in the specific conditions of North Africa. The land around Carthage could produce surpluses that fed the city's population and left enough over for export. That combination of agricultural productivity and maritime trade capability was what made Carthaginian power so durable and so difficult to dislodge. Roman observers who saw this wealth firsthand, or who heard accounts of it, came away with a feeling that is harder to name cleanly than simple envy or simple admiration. It was something more tangled. There was genuine respect for what Carthage had built, grudging in the way that respect often is when it threatens something, and layered underneath it something closer to anxiety. Because Rome was also growing, also accumulating, also learning to think of the Mediterranean as its own future domain. And Carthage was already there, already established, already the centre of a network that Rome wanted. The wealth of Carthage was not just impressive, it was, from a Roman perspective, a problem. Not yet an existential one, but the seed of that thought was already present, waiting for the right conditions to grow into something much more dangerous. Step away from the docks and the counting houses and the warehouses, and Carthage changes texture. The clang of metal and the shouting of stevedores fades. The smell of tar and fish gives way to something different. Olive oil and baking bread. The faint tang of wood smoke. Incense if you pass close enough to a shrine. The city is still busy, still layered with purpose, but now the movement is more domestic. Children weaving between adults, donkeys loaded with firewood or amphorae of water, women negotiating over vegetables in shaded alleys. Above it all, on heights overlooking the city and the sea, stand the places the Carthaginians thought of as their real anchors. Not the harbours, the gods. The two names that appear again and again in inscriptions and dedications are Baal-Hamon and Tanit. You can think of Baal-Hamon as something like a sky and weather god, fused with a guardian of fertility and kingship, though that's a simplification, and the ancient categories don't line up neatly with ours. Tanit, often invoked alongside him, is harder to pin down in a single phrase. She's associated with protection, with fertility, with the city itself. Her symbol, a stylized figure with outstretched arms and a crescent and disc above, appears on stelae, on amulets, on the walls of sanctuaries across the Carthaginian world. Walk into one of those sanctuaries, and you're stepping into a theological inheritance that has crossed from the Levant to North Africa and then grown in its own direction. The language of the inscriptions is Punic, a local evolution of Phoenician, still Semitic, still cousin to Hebrew and Aramaic. A priest reciting a formula of dedication in Carthage around 300 BC would have sounded to a visitor from Tyre or Sidon, not like an alien but like a relative with an accent. The words themselves, as far as we can reconstruct them, are often startlingly personal. To Our Lady Tanit, to Baal-Hamon, what was vowed, because he heard my voice and blessed me, for the life of my son, for the life of my house. Names are carved into stone not just to honour the gods, but to mark relationships, bargains, gratitude. In that sense, the Carthaginians are familiar. They're doing what humans have done everywhere, trying to weave their fragile lives into something bigger and hoping the universe is listening. Inside the city, that impulse runs right down into the street level. Picture a townhouse in one of Carthage's residential quarters is not a palace, not a slum. A solid, multi-story home belonging to a family somewhere in the middle and upper middle bands of the city's hierarchy. The front opens narrowly onto the street, a plain facade, maybe a small threshold where a household deity sits in a niche. Inside, around a central courtyard open to the sky, life unfolds in layers. In one corner of the courtyard, someone is grinding grain on a quern stone. The repetitive scrape of stone on stone has been the background music of daily life for thousands of years. A child dashes past and nearly colliding with the grinder, is scolded, laughs, and keeps moving. Upstairs, on a flat roof, strips of fish or meat are drying in the sun. Amphorae line a wall storing olive oil, wine, garum, grain. The smells are domestic, ordinary, a blend of food and sweat and clay and hearth. This is not a world where family is a small nuclear unit behind a closed door. Households can be large, extended networks of parents, married sons, unmarried daughters, in-laws, servants, enslaved people. Patriarchal, yes, senior men hold formal authority, make contracts, serve in assemblies. But women are not invisible. Inscriptions show Carthaginian women dedicating to gods in their own names. Economic documents hint at women involved in property and business. Grave goods and iconography suggest that motherhood and household management carried social weight that went beyond the purely private. Carthaginian society is stratified. At the top, powerful lineages that you could almost call aristocratic, controlling large estates, ships, political offices. Below them, layers of free citizens with varying degrees of wealth and influence. Below them still, foreigners, resident traders, freedmen, enslaved labourers working in homes, in the countryside, in workshops. The exact legal gradations are frustratingly opaque to us. The sources are sparse, the terminology slippery. But the lived reality is easy enough to imagine. People knew their place, who they could appeal to, who they owed deference, who they could command. Language binds this social world together. On the streets, Punic is what you hear most. Short, clipped phrases, guttural consonants, familiar patterns if you've ever listened to spoken Arabic or Hebrew. But listen more carefully and you'd pick up other currents. Greek, in the mouths of foreign merchants and intellectuals. Native North African languages, often called Libyan in the ancient sources, spoken by migrants from the hinterland and by those whose families have been here since before Carthage existed. Later, as Rome's presence in Sicily and Sardinia grows, Latin begins to appear too, first as the speech of a foreign power, then gradually as another layer of the city's linguistic tapestry. People in Carthage are not wandering around thinking of themselves primarily as characters in a geopolitical clash between Rome and the East. They're worrying about the price of grain, about whether the winter rains will come on time, about a sick child, about a marriage negotiation, about securing a contract for ship timber. They're going to neighbourhood shrines, making small offerings, attending festivals. They're hiring scribes to draft documents in neat Punic script. They're arguing over inheritances, they're gossiping. And then, above and behind all this everyday life, there is the question that has haunted Carthage's memory for 2 millennia. What exactly happened in its most sacred spaces? Roman and Greek authors, writing from outside and often from positions of hostility, insist that the Carthaginians practiced child sacrifice to Baal Hammon and Tanit. They paint lurid pictures, infants burned in the arms of bronze statues, drums beating to drown out the cries, parents making offerings in exchange for favour in war or harvest. These accounts are not neutral. They appear in works that are also full of patriotic rhetoric, political invective, and the casual dehumanization of enemies that was common in ancient literature. But archaeology complicates any easy dismissal. On a hillside near the city's core lies an area modern scholars call the Tophet. In antiquity it was a sanctuary. Here excavators have found urns buried under stelae, each urn containing cremated bones of very young individuals, infants, sometimes late-term fetuses, mixed in some cases with the remains of small animals. The stelae above them bear inscriptions dedicating vows to Tanit and Baal Hammon, asking for or thanking for a favour. What does that mean? One line of interpretation held by many scholars is that the Tophet is precisely what the hostile sources describe, a cult site where children were killed as offerings. The combination of infant remains, cremation, dedicatory inscriptions, and the sheer number of burials over centuries seems, in this view, to match ritual sacrifice rather than ordinary burial practice. Another line of interpretation pushes back. It notes that infant mortality in antiquity was tragically high. It suggests that the Tophet may have been a cemetery for children who died naturally, whose remains were then incorporated into a ritual framework that interpreted their loss in religious terms. The language of vows and offerings in this reading could reflect parents dedicating their dead children to the gods in an attempt to find meaning or consolation, not killing them deliberately. Adding to the complexity, some bioarchaeological studies have tried to assess the age profile and health of the remains. Some suggest the bones are consistent with perinatal and infant deaths at rates plausible for a large ancient city, and that there is no clear skeletal evidence of trauma. Others argue that bone preservation is too poor to detect certain causes of death, and that the demographic pattern doesn't match a normal cemetery population. The debate is ongoing and likely to remain unsettled, because the evidence is fragmentary and the ethical stakes of interpretation are high. Here's what we can say safely. The Carthaginians took this sanctuary very seriously. They returned to it generation after generation. They associated it with their most powerful deities. They framed what happened there in terms of vows, gifts, and divine favour. Whether those acts included the intentional killing of children, or were responses to the anguish of losing them, or some combination that doesn't fit cleanly into our categories, we cannot state with absolute precision. What we can resist is the temptation inherited from Rome to reduce an entire civilization to this single charged practice. Because even if, at some moments, and in some circles, the most extreme stories are true, those moments sit inside a much larger world. A world where a father teaches his son how to read Punic letters scratched in wax. Where a mother shows her daughter how to spin wool and keeps a household god's image cleaned and perfumed. Where dock workers joke in the shade during a lull in unloading. Where a priest lights incense and mutters a standard prayer not with blood on his hands, but with the tired familiarity of a man who has already said these words 1,000 times. At night, in Carthage, the hum of the day softens. Lamps glow in courtyards. Wind from the sea drifts through narrow lanes. Somewhere, on a rooftop, a family gathers to eat bread dipped in oil and share a dish of stewed lentils or fish. They talk about business, or neighbours, or news from Sicily. Someone mentions Rome, perhaps. Someone shrugs, changes the subject. The children are falling asleep, their heads heavy against parents' laps. For them, Rome is not yet destiny. It's just another city, another power in a world full of them. That is the Carthage that is hardest to remember from a distance of 2,000 years. Not the enemy in Roman speeches, not the pile of ruins that later travellers would stare at, but the lived city, its gods invoked over kitchen tables and legal contracts, its customs embedded in the habits of merchants and farmers, its daily rhythms as ordinary and as precious as any that have ever existed. And it is that Carthage, as much as the one that marched armies across the Alps, that Rome will eventually decide cannot be allowed to stand. Across the water, while lamps are being lit in Carthaginian courtyards, another city is finishing its own long day. Rome is smaller, at first, less polished, less cosmopolitan. No circular war harbour, no global trading network, a town on a river, then a city lording it over central Italy. Its gods are old and local, its streets still half mud when Carthage is already thinking in 3 continents at once. For a long time, these two places might as well exist in different worlds. Carthage looks south and west, to its Libyan hinterland, to the rich farmlands of Tunisia, to Sardinia and Corsica, to the silver of Spain. Rome looks inward, to the Apennines, to neighbouring Latin towns, to the hills and valleys of the Italian peninsula. They grow in parallel, not in collision. But maps do not stay still, and there is an island in the middle that will draw their circles together. If you stand on the western tip of Sicily on a clear day, you can almost trace the logic with your eyes. To the north, across relatively short stretches of sea, lie Sardinia and Corsica, and beyond them the coasts of Gaul and the Ligurian harbours. To the west, Spain, to the east, the toe of Italy, to the south, North Africa, only a few days sailing away. Sicily is not just land. It is a crossroads suspended in water. Carthage understood this early. Phoenician and Punic settlements lined the western and southern shores. Motia, Panormus, Lilybaeum. Greek city-states had taken much of the east. Syracuse, Agrigentum, Messana. In between, smaller communities, indigenous cycles and sicans, local powers making their own deals with whoever seemed advantageous. Control Sicily, and you reach into almost every major route of the Western Mediterranean. You can monitor, tax, or harass trade passing between east and west, north and south. You can project power toward Italy, Spain, Africa, Greece. For Carthage, protecting its Sicilian ports is about safeguarding commercial arteries and defensive buffers. For Rome, once it has fought its way to dominance over the Italian mainland, those same harbours begin to look like potential daggers pointed toward the peninsula's soft underbelly. The first contact is not a grand ideological clash. It is, as so often in history, a messy local problem. At the northeastern tip of Sicily sits Messana, guarding the narrow strait that separates the island from the Italian mainland. In the early 3rd century BC, a group of Italian mercenaries, the Mamertines, seize the city. They bottle up the strait, raid the countryside, and make themselves hated by everyone nearby. Eventually things go badly for them. Syracuse, under a capable ruler named Hieron, pressures Messana. The Mamertines, desperate, look for help. Some appeal to Carthage, others appeal to Rome. Carthage responds first, sending a garrison. Then Rome debates. Helping a band of pirates and mercenaries is not flattering. Some Roman senators argue that it would be more honourable to leave them to their fate. Others see something else, an opportunity. If Rome accepts, if Roman legions cross to Sicily, Rome will, for the first time, be committing its forces outside the Italian mainland, stepping into a space where Carthage has been a major player for generations. After much argument, Rome decides to intervene. The reasons are probably a mix of fear and ambition. Fear that Carthaginian control of Messana and Syracuse could one day be turned against southern Italy. Ambition, seeing Sicily's wealth and its strategic value. Roman troops cross the strait. Carthaginian troops are already there. Syracuse is involved. Alliances shift. The local quarrel suddenly stretches, taut between two expanding powers that have never before tested each other directly. It becomes known to us as the First Punic War. War makes it sound straightforward, a single, coherent campaign. In reality, it is a grinding, exhausting, stop-and-start conflict that will last for over 2 decades, from 264 to 241 BC. A war that neither side originally plans to be so long, and that will transform both. The first thing Rome discovers is that it is very good at fighting on land and very bad at fighting on water. Carthage, by contrast, has built its strength on the sea. Its merchants and admirals know the winds, the currents, the hidden reefs. Its warships, sleek quinqueremes with trained crews, have been refined by generations of rivalry with Greeks and Sicilian powers. Early engagements make this painfully clear. On land, Roman legions win sieges, beat back Carthaginian and Syracusan forces, adapt swiftly to Sicilian terrain. At sea, Carthaginian fleets slice through Roman attempts to resupply, cut lines, land troops behind them. Rome, a city that until now has mostly thought of the sea as a border to be wary of, faces an unpleasant reality. It cannot win a war in Sicily without contesting Carthage's maritime dominance. So Rome does something that, from a distance, can look almost insane. It decides to become a naval power, from scratch. Imagine a society whose strength has always been its infantry, whose elites own land, not shipyards. Now imagine that society in the middle of a grueling campaign abroad, deciding to build dozens, then hundreds of warships, highly complex, expensive machines that require not just timber and bronze, but skilled carpenters, rowers, helmsmen, drill routines, command structures. The story the Romans later told, and that later historians love to repeat, has a Carthaginian quinquereme running aground, captured and dragged ashore. Roman shipwrights, according to this tale, swarmed over it, measured every beam and peg, and used it as a template to mass-produce their own version. Whether that detail is literal or embellished, the core point stands. Rome treated shipbuilding the way it treated roads, bridges, and siege works, as a problem of engineering, organisation, and will. They conscripted tens of thousands of rowers. Many were poor citizens, some likely allied Italians, some perhaps even freed or enslaved labour. They trained on land first, men sitting on benches practising the rhythm of pulling oars in unison. before the ships were even launched. Then they added something that seems, at first glance, counterintuitive: the corvus, a heavy boarding bridge with a spike at the end. In a pure naval engagement, manoeuvre and ramming are everything. You want speed, agility, skilled helmsmen. The Carthaginians excelled at that style of combat. Rome did not, so the Romans tried to drag the fight back into the domain where they were confident. Close quarters, infantry battle. When a Carthaginian ship came close, the Roman crew would drop the corvus. The spike would bite into the enemy's deck, locking the ships together. Suddenly this was not a contest of piloting, but of hand-to-hand fighting on planks. A tiny, tilting battlefield where Roman soldiers in armour could do what they had been trained for since youth. In some early battles this worked startlingly well. Roman fleets that should, on paper, have been outclassed, won by turning sea fights into boarding actions. Carthaginian commanders learned to be wary of those awkward-looking Roman ships with their dangerous gangways. But innovation had a price. The corvus made ships top-heavy. In rough seas, Roman fleets suffered catastrophic losses from storms. Dozens, even hundreds of ships went down in single tempests. An entire generation of rowers, marines, carpenters drowned. Carthage suffered its own disasters and defeats, but Rome's learning curve was soaked in salt water and blood. Meanwhile, on land in Sicily, both sides bled and spent. Sieges dragged on for years. Cities changed hands, sometimes more than once. Local communities tried to read the wind, switching allegiances based on who seemed likely to win or who was currently camped outside their walls. For ordinary Sicilians, the war meant requisitions, devastation of fields, the constant unease of having foreign armies nearby. Carthage relied heavily on mercenary forces, Numidian cavalry, Iberian infantry, Greek and Libyan contingents, supplemented by citizen levies and allied troops. This gave them access to diverse fighting styles, but also layered their war effort with questions of pay, loyalty and cohesion. Rome leaned on its network of Italian allies. City after city sent contingents year after year. Losses that might have broken a smaller state, fleets gone, armies ambushed, were made good the following season with fresh levies. To Carthaginian observers this must have been unsettling, an enemy that, no matter how often you knock it down, seems able to stand up again and keep coming. After more than 20 years the edges began to fray. Carthage, strained by the costs of replacing ships and paying mercenaries, hesitated at key moments. Rome, having finally honed a competent navy and found able commanders at sea, used that advantage ruthlessly. At the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BC, a Roman fleet intercepted and defeated a Carthaginian convoy, bringing reinforcements to Sicily. It was not the bloodiest battle of the war, but strategically it broke the stalemate. Carthage, facing renewed financial and military pressure, opted for peace. The terms were harsh. Carthage gave up Sicily, which became Rome's first province outside Italy. It paid a large indemnity over time. The island that had been Carthage's shield and springboard in the central Mediterranean was now a Roman outpost. The consequences ran deeper than lines on a treaty. Rome emerged from the First Punic War with its first overseas territory, and, just as importantly, with the infrastructure, experience, and mindset of a naval power. It had learned to think beyond its peninsula, to project force by sea as well as by land. Carthage emerged wounded but not broken. It still held its African heartland, its Spanish ambitions, much of its commerce. Yet it had been forced to recognize something sobering. There was now on the northern shore a rival that could match and even surpass its capacity for endurance. Between the two, a new pattern settled in. Not yet the existential hatred of later slogans, but a wary, simmering rivalry. In Rome, senators who had once thought of Carthage as a distant merchant city now saw it as a dangerous competitor. In Carthage, families whose fortunes were tied to trade and land looked at Rome's hunger and wondered what might be next. And under the hostility, there was also, inevitably, a kind of grudging respect. Roman writers, even as they reviled Carthage, admired its ships, its commercial acumen, its tenacity at sea. Carthaginian commanders and merchants could hardly fail to notice Rome's discipline, its capacity to suffer disaster and return stronger, its willingness to build, learn and adapt with terrifying speed. For 23 years they had tested each other's limits around the coasts and fields of Sicily. Neither side forgot the lessons. In Carthage, in some upper rooms smelling of oil and parchment, a group of men would be talking through options. The Sicilian ports lost, the indemnity looming, the need for new sources of wealth, new allies, new plans. One of the names mentioned in those conversations, perhaps only in passing at first, belongs to a man from a powerful Barcid family, a man who will look not towards Sicily but towards Spain. And on the other side of the sea in Rome, there are boys growing up who will come of age in a city that now thinks of itself as a Mediterranean power. Some of them will, in a few decades, find themselves staring northward in disbelief as news arrives. A Carthaginian army has crossed the Alps, but that is still in the future. For now, in the uneasy quiet after the First Punic War, Rome and Carthage stand facing each other across a strip of water that feels narrower than ever before, each calculating, each nursing wounds, each preparing, in their own way, for what will come after Hannibal's storm. By the time Hannibal's name is first whispered in the Roman Senate, Sicily is already gone from Carthaginian hands, and the Barcid family has turned its eyes to Spain. In the years after the First Punic War, while Rome consolidates its new province and experiments with governing territory across the sea, Carthage is rebuilding the way it knows best, through commerce and calculated expansion. The Barcids carve out a quasi-private empire in Iberia. Mines, timber, mercenary recruitment grounds, a place to pay off old debts and finance new ambitions. Rome watches, uneasily, but its gaze is not yet fixed. There are wars in northern Italy, skirmishes in Illyria, internal reforms to manage. The Republic is busy being a regional great power. It has not yet fully imagined that someone might try to unmake it. That imagination arrives on the back of elephants. You are a Roman farmer in the countryside near the Tiber when the first rumours reach you. A Carthaginian general has marched an army through Gaul. He has crossed the Alps, and brought war into northern Italy. At first, it sounds like exaggeration, terrifying, but distant. Then the news keeps getting worse. A Roman army is destroyed at the Ticinia, another beaten at the Trebia. The defeats pile up, each one closer, each one more shocking. The Senate responds in the way it knows. It raises more legions, calls on its allies, sends consuls north to stop this advance. Then comes Cannae. In 216 BC, on a dusty plain in Apulia, Rome puts into the field one of the largest armies it has ever assembled, perhaps as many as 80,000 men. Political tensions at home have pushed for a decisive confrontation. If they can crush Hannibal here, the nightmare ends. Instead, the nightmare deepens. Hannibal arranges his forces in a crescent, with a deliberately weaker centre and strong wings of cavalry and hardened infantry. The Romans deploy in deep, heavy columns, intending to smash straight through. As the fighting begins, Hannibal's centre slowly yields, bending inward. Roman legionaries, thinking they are breaking the enemy line, press forward into the bulge. Meanwhile, Carthaginian and allied cavalry rout the Roman horse on the flanks, wheel around, and strike the Roman rear. The crescent snaps shut. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers find themselves hemmed in on all sides, unable to manoeuvre. It becomes not a battle, but a slaughter. Ancient sources, always eager for big numbers, give estimates for Roman and allied dead that climb above 50,000 in a single day. Even if the true figure is lower, it is still one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. You can imagine the aftermath. Lists of the fallen posted in the forum, families pressing forward, reading with numb eyes, searching for husbands, fathers, sons. The line between public tragedy and private grief blurring, because everyone knows someone who did not come home. Rome goes into shock. There are no more full-scale field battles for a while. The Republic, so used to answering a blow with a blow, now has to think about not collapsing. It abolishes, for a time, the rituals of celebration. No more weddings with loud music, no more extravagant public displays. Women are told to limit their mourning in public, but the streets are heavy with black anyway. The Senate does something else that reveals the depth of anxiety. It turns, more intensely than usual, to the gods. Prodigies and omens are reported with grim regularity. A statue weeps, a calf is born with 2 heads, lightning strikes a temple roof. Each event is debated, interpreted, answered with vows and sacrifices. At one desperate moment the Romans even revive a ghastly ritual that they normally avoid, the live burial of 2 Greeks and 2 Gauls in the Forum, intended as a propitiatory offering to underworld powers. It is an act that later Romans will look back on with discomfort, as a sign of how terrified their ancestors were. Hannibal, meanwhile, moves like a dark weather system across Italy. Some cities defect to him, others hold for Rome and pay the price in siege and starvation. The great southern ally Capua will eventually throw its lot in with Carthage, only to suffer terrible retribution later. For more than a decade, there is a Carthaginian army on Italian soil. Think about what that means for Roman memory. Entire cohorts of young men grow up never knowing a time when there isn't an enemy general somewhere in their countryside, raiding allied territories, burning fields, testing loyalties. Fathers tell their children, "When I was your age, the Carthaginian was already here." This isn't a raid or a single campaign. It's a long, grinding pressure. Rome adapts the way it did at sea in the First Punic War, but now under far worse emotional strain. A series of commanders, Fabius Maximus chief among them, argue for a different kind of war. Avoid pitched battles with Hannibal, shadow him, harass his foraging parties, deny him supplies, isolate his allies, let time and distance do what frontal assault cannot. To many proud Romans, this strategy feels cowardly at first. They call Fabius cunctator, the delayer, yet delay becomes survival. While legions hover and watch, Rome digs in at home. It raises new armies year after year, drawing deeper on its citizen body and its Italian allies than anyone thought possible. Young men barely of age are pressed into service. Older men return to the line. Defeats that would have ended some states simply lead to another levy, another conscription, another year of war. The Roman political culture hardens. In earlier generations, generals might be forgiven for failure if circumstances were difficult. After Cannae, after so many losses, failure begins to carry a sharper stigma. Commanders know that disaster can mean exile, prosecution, disgrace. The stakes for leadership rise. Meanwhile, ordinary Romans are living through something that will echo in their descendants' minds for centuries. They endure higher taxes, requisitions of grain and livestock, and the absence of sons and brothers for years at a time. They see allied cities burned for rebellion, watch prisoners march through the streets, listen to speeches about perseverance in the face of total ruin. The phrase that later generations will attribute to this period, Hannibal at the gates, isn't just a metaphor. There are times when his army's within a few days' march of Rome. Once he rides up to the city itself, surveys the walls, and then turns away. He never directly assaults the capital, but the idea that he might burns itself into Roman collective imagination. All of this leaves marks. Long after the Second Punic War ends, Roman senators and writers will use Hannibal as a measuring stick for danger, for cunning, for foreign threat. Children will be told stories of the days when we nearly lost everything. Military prudence, suspicion of overseas powers, and a certain fatalistic toughness become part of how Rome sees itself. In the end, despite all his brilliant marches and victories, Hannibal loses the war. Not because he is suddenly less capable, but because Rome refuses to break, and because Carthage cannot or will not match the same level of sustained commitment. While Hannibal fights in Italy, Rome sends forces outwards, to Spain, to Sicily, to North Africa. One of these commanders, a young Publius Cornelius Scipio, learns his craft the hard way against Carthaginian forces in Iberia. He observes their methods, their strengths, their reliance on particular allies and regions. Eventually he takes the war to Carthage's doorstep. In 204 BC, Roman troops land in North Africa. They win over Numidian allies, cut into Carthaginian support networks, and threaten the city itself. Carthage, faced with invasion at home, recalls Hannibal from Italy. The final confrontation comes at Zama in 202 BC. Here, unlike Cannae, the field tilts Rome's way. Scipio has learned. He arranges his troops to blunt the charge of Carthaginian war elephants, uses flexible maniples to absorb and then reform after the initial shock, and relies on Numidian cavalry allies to secure the flanks. Hannibal's army fights hard, but it is not the hardened veteran force of his early Italian campaigns. Many of his best men were lost in earlier battles and years of attrition. The result is a Roman victory convincing enough that Carthage has to sue for peace. The terms this time are more than harsh, they are humiliating. Carthage must give up most of its remaining overseas possessions. Its war fleet is reduced to a token handful of ships. The rest are surrendered and, according to later accounts, burned in a grim spectacle. It loses much of its autonomy in foreign policy, forbidden to wage war outside Africa and even within Africa without Roman permission. A huge indemnity is imposed, payable over decades. Hostages are taken. Carthage is left formally independent but strategically muzzled. From one angle, you might expect that to be the end of the story. A proud city defeated, shackled, pushed to the sidelines. From another angle, what happens next is more unsettling. Carthage does what it has always done. It adapts. Deprived of the ability to wage major wars, it throws itself even more fully into commerce and agriculture. Its location is still excellent. Its harbours, though no longer stocked with great war fleets, still see merchant traffic. Its hinterland is still fertile. Over the next 50 years, Carthage pays off its enormous indemnity ahead of schedule. Archaeology and ancient testimony alike suggest that its economy recovers, perhaps even flourishes, once the immediate shock of defeat passes. The great estates of its hinterland continue to produce grain, olives, and other goods. Trade routes are reoriented rather than abandoned. Carthaginian merchants, constrained politically, remain creative economically. To many Romans, this is impressive. To some, it is infuriating. You can imagine a Roman senator leaning over a map, tapping the coast of Africa with one finger. "We broke them," he says to a colleague. "We stripped them of their fleet, their empire, their right to make war, and still they prosper. Do you not see the danger in that?" Part of the unease is practical. A wealthy Carthage, even disarmed, can hire mercenaries if given the chance. It can cultivate allies. It can influence neighbouring Numidian kings. Money, in the Mediterranean world as in any other, is its own kind of weapon. Part of the unease is psychological. The men dominating the Senate in the mid-2nd century BC are often the children or grandchildren of those who lived through Hannibal's Italian campaign. They grew up on stories of farms burned, allies defecting, loved ones not returning from the front. For them, Carthage is not just a city on the African shore. It is the origin point of the worst collective trauma Rome has experienced. Even as Roman power expands into Greece, into Spain, into the eastern Mediterranean, a portion of the Roman elite keeps looking south and west, toward that familiar curve of coastline. Carthage is obeying the treaties mostly. It is not building great fleets again. It is not sending generals over the Alps. But its warehouses are full, its fields are green. Its city is, by all accounts, thriving under the constraints. To a secure, confident empire, this might be tolerable. To a republic that remembers standing on the edge of annihilation, it feels like a ticking problem. Fear and ambition, once more, begin to braid themselves together. In Senate debates, one phrase will start to surface more and more often. Not yet the famous Carthage must be destroyed, but arguments that run close to it, that Rome cannot ever truly be safe while that city remains strong, even in peace. The storm Hannibal unleashed did not just scour fields and consume armies. It carved a groove in Roman memory, a channel down which later anxieties would run. And as Carthage, wounded but resilient, climbs back toward prosperity, that groove will help guide the Republic toward an extraordinary decision, to turn on an already defeated rival, and this time, not to stop at terms or indemnities. To imagine instead an ending in which a city is not merely beaten, but erased. Stand for a moment on the African shoreline again, but move the clock forward a few decades. The war indemnity is paid. Hannibal is long gone, exiled, and then hunted down across the eastern Mediterranean. Roman fleets have moved on to other theatres. On the surface, the relationship between Rome and Carthage is stable, uneasy, but stable. The real pressure is coming from a different direction. To Carthage's west and south lies Numidia, a patchwork of kingdoms and tribes spread across what is now roughly Algeria and parts of Tunisia. In Roman narratives, this land is semi-wild, full of skilled horsemen and shifting alliances. For Carthage, it has always been more complicated. Neighbour, trading partner, competitor, sometime foe. One Numidian king in particular matters now, Massinissa. When Scipio first brought Roman legions to Africa, Massinissa chose his side carefully. He aligned with Rome against Carthage and their previous Numidian ally Syphax. At Zama, his cavalry played a crucial role in smashing Hannibal's flanks. Rome noticed. After the war, Massinissa was rewarded. Over the years, that reward grows. Massinissa is allowed, some Roman writers would say quietly encouraged, to nibble away at Carthaginian territory. A disputed pasture here, a border town there. Sometimes he sends raiders, sometimes he plants settlers, sometimes he simply moves boundary markers and dares anyone to object. For Carthage, this is a nightmare scenario. On paper, the Treaty of 201 BC forbids them from making war outside Africa, and even within Africa they cannot take up arms without Roman permission. In practice, that means they cannot legally defend themselves against a neighbour who is also Rome's friend. Imagine being a Carthaginian landowner in the countryside during these years. You see Numidian horsemen appear on the horizon, fields trampled, herds driven off, perhaps a watchtower set ablaze. Your city cannot simply muster an army and ride out. It must send envoys across the sea, petition the very power that once tried to crush it, and hope that the Senate in faraway Rome cares about your broken boundary stone. Sometimes Rome sends commissions to investigate. Roman senators travel to North Africa, listen to Carthaginian complaints, listen to Massinissa's rebuttals, and then issue a judgment. The pattern, over time, is clear. Decisions usually tilt toward their Numidian ally. The Carthaginians record bitterly that the Romans always find a way to interpret the treaty in a manner favourable to Massinissa. From one angle, this looks like bias, or even a slow-motion strangling of Carthaginian territory. From another, it looks like opportunistic realpolitik, Rome using a client king as a buffer and a pressure tool without having to deploy legions itself. Both readings may contain truth. Inside Carthage, the political temperature rises. Every time a field is seized or a village is harassed, factions argue about what to do. One group, remembering Hannibal and the ruin that followed, urges patience, diplomacy, strict observance of the treaty. Another points to the steady loss of land and pride and asks how long a city can endure such humiliation and still call itself free. This is what being muzzled actually feels like on the ground. Not just military weakness, but political paralysis. Every major decision, especially any decision that involves armed force, must be filtered through the question, what will Rome do if we act? The answer is rarely comforting. Meanwhile, across the sea, Roman politics is changing too. By the mid-2nd century BC, Rome is no longer a regional power nervously holding Italy together. It is becoming something like an empire, even if Romans do not yet use that word in our sense. Victories against Macedon and the Seleucid kings in the east bring in wealth, slaves, prestige. Generals parade in triumph through the city, displaying captured treasure and chained prisoners. With success comes competition. Ambitious aristocrats need enemies to fight, provinces to govern, victories to claim. A quiet Mediterranean is bad for careers. Against this backdrop, Carthage survives as a useful symbol. It is a reminder of Rome's darkest hours and of one of its greatest comebacks. A convenient foil against which to define Roman virtue, discipline versus luxury, courage versus cunning, faithfulness versus supposed Punic treachery. Senators can invoke the memory of Hannibal to argue for new military expenditures, for tighter control over allies, for vigilance against any sign of foreign resurgence. One senator in particular will make Carthage his personal theme, Marcus Porcius Cato, often called Cato the Elder. Cato is, in Roman eyes, the embodiment of old-fashioned austerity, stern morals, simple living, suspicion of Greek luxuries and Eastern refinements. To him, the Republic must resist softness and decadence if it is to remain strong. Late in his life, Cato is sent on a commission to Africa to arbitrate yet another dispute between Carthage and Massinissa. He sees something that troubles him. Not a rebuilt war fleet or marching armies, as the treaty still holds, but prosperity, order, wealth. Carthage from his vantage point looks less like a broken enemy and more like a city quietly rearming its strength through agriculture and commerce. According to later tradition, he brings back a prop with his report, a fresh fig plucked in Carthage only days before. He holds it up in the Senate and lets his colleagues feel how little time has passed since it hung on a tree across the sea. So near, he implies, so capable of becoming a threat again. From this point on, Roman writers say, Cato ends almost every speech in the Senate with the same chilling refrain, whatever the topic under discussion, that Carthage must be destroyed. The Latin phrase they preserve, Carthago delenda est, roams across centuries as shorthand for implacable policy. How accurate this famous detail is in its specifics is hard to prove. It comes from sources writing later with their own agendas. But it captures something real about the mood forming in parts of the Roman elite, a conviction that leaving Carthage alive, even constrained, is an unacceptable risk. Not everyone agrees. Other senators, like Scipio Nasica, will be portrayed as arguing the opposite, that a strong but subordinate Carthage is useful. It gives Rome a rival to fear, a reason to maintain discipline, a check on arrogance. These debates, as far as we can reconstruct them, are not just about strategy. They're also about identity, what sort of power Rome intends to be. Security concerns, genuine and remembered, intertwine with expansionist appetite and domestic politics. Some Romans may sincerely believe that another Hannibal is only a generation away if Carthage is allowed to continue thriving. Others may see in Carthage's very prosperity a tempting prize, rich fields, bustling harbours, tax revenue. Still others may not especially care about Carthage itself, but recognise that campaigning against a historic enemy could elevate their own name and faction at home. Fear, ambition, and opportunity do not line up in neat columns. They overlap, reinforce, and sometimes disguise one another. Back in Africa, the pressure from Numidia continues, and Carthaginian patience finally snaps. In 151 BC, after yet another land dispute turns violent, Carthage raises an army, without Roman approval, and marches against Massinissa. It is, from the Carthaginian perspective, an act of self-defence long delayed. From the Roman perspective, it is something else, a treaty violation from a former enemy who'd been warned repeatedly to keep its sword sheathed. The campaign goes badly for Carthage. Massinissa proves a hard opponent. The Carthaginian army is defeated and forced into a degrading truce. Survivors straggle back to the city with tales of hunger, confusion, betrayal. The very act that was meant to restore pride instead deepens weakness. Yet in Rome, the fact of the campaign matters more than its outcome. Here, those years of anxiety and rhetoric pay off. When envoys arrive with news that Carthage has taken up arms without permission, it confirms every dark suspicion that hawks like Cato have been nurturing. They can point to the treaty text, to decades of complaints about Carthaginian resilience, to the vivid memory of Hannibal's war, and say, "We warned you, they are untrustworthy. They must be dealt with once and for all." Was war inevitable at this point? Some historians argue that the Third Punic War was the product of a long Roman strategy to eliminate Carthage whenever a plausible pretext appeared. Others see a more contingent picture, a series of local disputes, miscalculations, and political choices that could have gone differently. The truth may lie between. Structural pressures, Rome's growing power, its alliance with Massinissa, its deep trauma from the Second Punic War, created a landscape where almost any Carthaginian assertiveness would be read as aggression. What matters for our story is how it feels as it unfolds. In Rome, Senate debates grow sharper. Commissions are sent again to Africa, ostensibly to mediate, but also to assess. Some of these Roman envoys will later report that Carthage, disarmed and isolated by its own failed campaign, is now more vulnerable than it has been in decades. To those who want glory, this looks like a chance. To those who want security, it looks like the last best moment to act on their fears before Carthage finds a way to recover. To those who see the world as a competition for honour and dominance, it looks like an opportunity too clean to ignore. The outbreak of the Third Punic War does not explode from a single spark. It seeps out of years of erosion and pressure. Encroachments by a Numidian ally, legal traps woven into a peace treaty, political theatre in the Roman Senate, and real, remembered terror of a past invasion. Each piece by itself might have been manageable. Together they form a path that, step by step, leads toward a decision that will transform North Africa forever. When the Roman fleets finally appear off the coast again and consular armies disembark on the African shore, they are not coming for border adjustments or another indemnity. The arguments have already been rehearsed. The fears have already been stoked. The phrase that ended Cato's speeches has done its work. Now Rome will tell Carthage what price it demands for peace, and the terms will be crafted in such a way that accepting them means a slow death, and refusing them means a faster one. The Roman fleet does not creep over the horizon like a surprise storm. People in Carthage have been hearing rumours for months. Shipbuilders along the Tiber are busy. Consuls are chosen who have never known a world where Rome and Carthage were equals. Grain and timber are stockpiled. Deals are struck with Massinisa's heirs. By the time the masts appear as thin lines against the morning sky, many in the city already know what it means. Imagine standing on the city wall that day. The sea is calm, a sheet of blue broken by the white triangles of Roman sails. There is no battle line yet, no catapults being rolled into place. They anchor offshore with careful order. It looks almost ceremonial. Carthage does not attack. For all the anger burning in its streets, for all the humiliation of recent years, the city's leaders understand the balance of power. They cannot afford to be seen as the aggressor again. So instead of mobilizing the army they barely have, they send envoys. Old men in long robes, young interpreters with polished Latin, scribes carrying tablets. They go down to the harbour, board small boats, and row out toward the flagship of the Roman consul. There, in the shade of the great ship's awning, Rome presents its terms, not all at once. That is part of the strategy. The first message is reassuring in its way. The consuls announce that Rome has not come to destroy Carthage. They say this clearly, according to several later accounts. The quarrel officially is not with the city itself, but with certain elements within it. If Carthage cooperates, if it obeys, it will be spared. The envoys carry that assurance back over the water. In the council chamber, senators and magistrates listen. They want to believe it. They may not trust Roman promises, but the alternative, immediate war, is unthinkable. So when the next demand comes, they grit their teeth and comply. Rome's legions, the consuls say, will not advance toward the city if Carthage disarms. All weapons of war, siege engines, catapults, spears, armour, warships, must be handed over. The Romans will supervise. This, they insist, is a necessary guarantee of good faith. There is fierce debate in Carthage. Some argue that to surrender their arms is to expose their throats. Others point out that they are already exposed. The countryside is weakened, their army recently beaten, their navy limited by treaty. To refuse now is to invite an assault they are not ready for. In the end, the peace party wins, not because they are naive, but because they are out of options. Then, over the next days, a strange procession begins. Carthaginian officials comb the city for weapons. Bronze-tipped spears that have hung for generations over family hearths are taken down and carried to collection points. Old suits of armour are brought out from storerooms. Workshops surrender stocks of sharpened blades meant for export. In dockyards, shipwrights remove rams from the few armed vessels still allowed. Somewhere in the city, a soldier hands over the sword his father carried at Zama. Loads are stacked, recorded, escorted down to the harbour. Barges ferry them to the Roman camp. Ancient sources give numbers that may be exaggerated. Hundreds of thousands of weapons, thousands of catapults. But the psychological effect matters more than the exact tally. Each cart that leaves the city carries away not just metal, but a sense of safety. Parents watch their sons return from the collection depots empty-handed. Priests see sacred armour taken from temple storerooms, gear dedicated to gods now being turned over to foreign soldiers. The word spreads that even hunting spears have been seized. The city is being hollowed out. Then Rome asks for hostages. 300 if we follow one traditional figure. Prominent young men from leading families. They are to be sent to Sicily, held under Roman guard as surety for Carthage's future obedience. This, too, is an old practice in ancient diplomacy. Carthage itself has taken hostages from subject peoples in the past. That does not make it easier. Picture a courtyard filled with families, boys in their teens, some a little older, dressed for travel, mothers trying to maintain composure as they straighten cloaks and adjust belts, fathers admonishing their sons to be brave, to remember their city's honour, to charm their captors if they can. They embark with the Roman terms ringing in their ears. If Carthage causes no trouble, if it obeys, these hostages will be safe and eventually returned. The ships bearing them away shrink to dots on the horizon. The city feels lighter and emptier at the same time. From the Roman point of view, this is progress. Carthage has disarmed itself and given up its most valuable collateral. The consuls send positive reports back to the Senate. Their demands are being met. The enemy is cooperative. The stage is set. Only then do they unveil the real condition. One more message is sent ashore. This time, the envoys from Carthage are invited not just to the flagship, but farther inland to the Roman land camp. They walk past rows of tents, stacks of supplies, lines of soldiers sharpening blades that, unlike Carthage's, have not been surrendered. In the consul's tent, under whatever formalities applied, they hear the final decree. Carthage must be abandoned. The population, the consul explains, will be spared. Their lives, their personal property, their freedom will be respected, so the Romans say. But the city itself, its walls, its harbours, its temples may no longer exist where they stand. The people of Carthage must move at least a set distance inland. 10 miles from the sea is what later sources record, and there they may build a new settlement. On the shore where their ancestors launched ships to every corner of the Mediterranean, there will be nothing but ruins. It takes a moment for the words to land. For a Roman audience, this might sound almost merciful. No mass slaughter, no enslavement en masse, just relocation. Hard, but survivable. To a Carthaginian, it is something else entirely. Carthage is not just a cluster of houses by the water. It is a promontory, a pair of harbours carved and engineered over generations, a web of trade routes that all converge on that curve of Africa. It is a sacred landscape marked by temples whose orientations line up with rising constellations, by burial grounds and sanctuaries that have accumulated centuries of offerings. The city's very name is bound to its place. Carthage, the new city, founded by settlers from Tyre on this specific bay. To ask its people to move inland is to ask them to become someone else. Economically, the demand is lethal. Carthage's power rests on the sea, on merchant fleets, fishing grounds, shipyards, warehouses clustered by the docks. Move 10 miles inland and all of that disappears. You're no longer a maritime power, just another inland town competing for farmland. Religiously, it is a rupture. Deities like Baal Hammon and Tanit are not abstract concepts to be carried in a book. They are attached to altars, groves, particular stones anointed by countless rituals. To leave them behind feels like abandonment, perhaps even sacrilege. Politically and emotionally, it is erasure. The walls that once held off Roman assault, the gates where envoys passed, the forum where Hannibal walked, all to be demolished or left to decay. No monuments, no public buildings, no theatres surviving above the waves to remind future generations that this was once a rival to Rome. The envoys return to the city with this impossible news. You can imagine that council meeting, the elders' faces when they hear the final demand. The stunned silence, then the roar. Some may accuse the peace faction of being fooled. You handed over our spears, our catapults, our sons, they might say. And for what? To be told to tear down our own home? Others turn their anger outward, not inward. They argue that Rome never intended to let Carthage survive in any form that mattered. The earlier promises were bait leading to this trap. What do you do when every path leads toward destruction? If you accept the terms, you live, but as what? A disarmed inland community cut off from the sea that shaped your language, your worship, your memories. If you refuse, you face a Roman army while stripped of your weapons and with your youth held hostage across the water. This is the moment when the negotiation ceases to be real. There may still be formal exchanges, polite phrases, offers to modify minor details. But on the core point, leave the sea or face the sword, Rome does not bend. The consuls, armed with mandates and expectations, are unlikely to contemplate backing down. They have sailed too far, politically and literally, to return with anything less than submission. Inside Carthage, the mood hardens. People who are prepared to endure almost any humiliation for peace begin to reach the limit of what they can accept. Merchants who once argued for compromise now stand with fiery orators calling for resistance. Priests point to omens that condemn abandoning the city's sacred ground. Women who just handed over their sons as hostages demand that their sacrifice not be repaid with the death of the city itself. Somewhere, perhaps in a crowded assembly, someone makes the argument out loud that many are thinking quietly, that it is better to die defending Carthage than to live watching it reduced to dust. The decision is not purely emotional. There is calculation too. They know that Rome is strong, but they also know their walls are high, their warehouses stocked, their people numerous. They have wealthy citizens who can fund defences, craftsmen who can improvise weapons from tools and scrap, dock workers who know every curve of the shoreline. They understand siege warfare. They have been on the other side of it in Sicily and Spain, and they know that once Rome's final intention has been revealed so starkly, there may be nothing left to gain by further submission. The logic of appeasement collapses when the other side's end goal is the erasure of your way of life. Word spreads through the neighbourhoods, markets and temples. The Romans have demanded that we leave the sea. The reaction is visceral. Anger, fear, a wild stubborn pride. Workshops that yesterday were turned over for inspection now operate in secret. Men hide tools that can be reshaped into blades. Women stash away grain. Old soldiers begin quietly drilling younger men with whatever makeshift weapons can be gathered. Plans are whispered in taverns and family courtyards about how to withstand a siege with almost no official arsenal. The Third Punic War, in a formal sense, has already begun. But here, in this turning of hearts and minds inside the walls, another kind of war starts. A decision to resist, not because victory seems likely, but because the alternative is to accept the slow extinction of Carthage's identity. On the shore beyond those walls, Roman engineers start measuring distances, choosing ground for siege works, mapping the contours of the city they intend to break. In their camp, the disarmed weapons of Carthage lie stacked in neat piles, mute testimony to the bargain that was never meant to be honoured. Between the lines of soldiers and the lines of stone ramparts, a space opens up that can no longer be crossed by envoys and treaties. The last ultimatums have been delivered. The last impossible choice has been made. Now a city that has already outlived one catastrophe will prepare, knowingly, for another. Not for surrender, but for a final desperate stand on the very ground Rome has ordered it to abandon. The decision is made long before anyone announces it formally. It begins in the way people move. City guards who were supposed to hand in the last of their gear stop showing up at the collection depots. Temple attendants who once escorted officials to the harbour now spend their days in storerooms, quietly taking inventory. Shipwrights in the naval basin work with their doors half closed, hammering not on merchant hulls but on things no one is supposed to be building anymore. Carthage, disarmed on paper, starts to rearm in secret. No decree goes out that says, "Prepare for war." There is no single speech that turns the city from submission to resistance. It's more like a murmur that spreads from the Senate Hall into the streets, from the Forum into the workshops, from the noble courtyards down into the tenements by the harbour. Rome has demanded that the city cease to be. That sentence ripples through the population like a shock wave. When it hits each person, they make a choice: to leave, to stay, to fight, to hide. Collectively, almost unconsciously, they move in the same direction. They prepare to withstand a siege that everyone knows, in some quiet part of their mind, may end in ruin. Inside the city, the first priority is weapons. The Romans have carted away the obvious stockpiles, the racks of spears in the armories, the siege engines in their warehouses, the blades in the public storehouses. What they do not have, and cannot easily track, is everything made of metal in a city that has been trading and manufacturing for centuries. That is where the artisans come in. In a narrow lane that smells of charcoal and oil, a bronze worker closes his shutters and opens his furnace. For years he has cast fittings for ships, decorative plaques for doorways, braziers and lamps for wealthy houses. Now, quietly, he reshapes his moulds. Door hinges are melted down. Ornate railing posts disappear from balconies. Bronze statues in private gardens lose an arm, a spear, a decorative flourish that no one will miss in the short term. All of that goes into the furnace. What emerges are blades, short swords, daggers, spearheads, without shafts yet. Ironworkers do the same. Carthage does not have as much iron as some inland peoples, but over generations they have accumulated plenty of tools: ploughshares, chisels, axes, nails, chain. These items are gathered up, sometimes bought at inflated prices by rich patriots, sometimes borrowed from unlocked storerooms. Blacksmiths work day and night, reshaping farm tools into weapons. A pruning hook becomes a wickedly curved blade. A woodcutter's axe is thinned and sharpened until it can split more than firewood. The pacing of the city changes. Hammers ring at strange hours. The glow of furnaces leaks out under doors long after midnight. To anyone listening from the Roman camp, it might sound like ordinary life in a busy port. Inside, Carthage knows exactly what it's doing. Women bring fuel to the workshops, bundles of kindling, sacks of charcoal. Children act as runners, carrying messages, fetching water, delivering small parcels wrapped in cloth. No one says aloud what is inside those packages. No one needs to. The elites, who once measured their importance in ships owned and estates managed, take on a different role. Some open their private treasuries, donating silver and gold to buy raw materials, pay workers, stockpile food. Others turn their townhouses into armories. Courtyards that once hosted banquets now hold stacks of spear shafts, lengths of rope, baskets full of sling stones smoothed by years of tumbling in riverbeds. They also do something else that may seem surprising. They organize labour. Carthage is full of people who know how to build, dig, haul. Dockworkers, quarrymen, brickmakers, carpenters. These men and women have spent their lives creating things for trade and profit. Warehouses, piers, roads, cisterns. Now the ruling families, through networks of clients and dependents, redirect that same machinery of work toward survival. One clan takes responsibility for a section of wall, inspecting it, reinforcing weak points, clearing the ground in front of it so enemy siege engines will have no cover. Another family sponsors the repair of old towers, paying masons to reface stone, carpenters to install new floors and ladders, watchmen to be permanently posted. On the great land walls facing inland, gangs of labourers are set to work with picks and shovels. They deepen ditches, steepen embankments, build inner ramparts that will give defenders a second line if the outer wall is breached. Where the city slopes down to the sea, attention turns to the harbours. Rome has seen the outer merchant basin, with its curved shore and forest of masts. It knows in general that Carthage once had a powerful navy. What the consuls do not fully grasp yet is the scale and sophistication of the inner military harbour. The Kothon, a circular basin ringed with ship sheds, repair facilities, storage rooms, all hidden behind the line of outer buildings. Carthaginian shipwrights move into these spaces like ants returning to a disturbed nest. Under the shadow of vaulted roofs they lay keels, reassemble hulls that were half dismantled to comply with old treaties, drag half-rotted triremes out of storage and strip them for usable parts. They work with whatever they have: old planks, scavenged beams from decommissioned buildings, repurposed masts from cargo ships. A vessel that once carried grain to Sicily is strengthened and fitted with oarlocks. Its wide hull may not be ideal for ramming manoeuvres, but it can carry men, supplies, perhaps burn with pitch if needed in a fireship attack. Sailmakers stitch late into the night. Rope twisters stretch fibres until their fingers bleed. Oars are carved from timber that might otherwise have gone into new houses. No one is thinking about future building projects anymore. The city's resources are being pulled inward, converted into things that buy time. Time is what Carthage needs most. Rome, used to city-states folding after a show of force, may believe that once the first trenches are dug and the first battering rams rolled into place, the defenders' will to resist will evaporate. Many cities, faced with Roman legions, have opened their gates rather than endure the starvation and terror of a drawn-out siege. Carthage sets out to disappoint that expectation. Food is counted, then counted again. Grain stores are inventoried not just in public granaries, but in private warehouses, temple storerooms, the cellars of wealthy merchants. Officials and volunteers move from district to district, estimating how long each neighbourhood can last. Excess is requisitioned and moved to central depots where it can be guarded and rationed. People who have spent their lives eating imported delicacies adjust to simpler fare. Household cooks stretch recipes, substitute ingredients, experiment with preserving methods, salted fish, dried fruit, smoked meat, pickled vegetables. Anything that can last months rather than days is suddenly valuable. In poorer quarters, neighbours band together to create communal kitchens. Those who have little share with those who have less in exchange for labour on the fortifications. The idea is simple. If the city is to hold, no part of it can be allowed to starve too quickly. Hungry people break before walls do. There is fear, of course. It winds through the streets like a cold draught. Mothers look at their children and imagine them during a siege, thinner, weaker, faces hollowed by hunger. Shopkeepers calculate how many days of income remain before trade grinds to a halt. Old men remember the last time Roman soldiers were this close and what happened in the countryside. At night, rumours multiply. Some say Rome will launch a massive assault immediately. Others insist that the Senate will change its mind once it sees Carthage's determination. There are whispers of allies abroad who might intervene, of revolts rising in Italy, of prophecies that claim the city cannot fall while a certain statue stands or a certain flame burns. Amid this anxiety, something harder sets in, a kind of stubborn calm. Young men gather in the open spaces between blocks, being drilled with whatever weapons can be spared. Some carry real spears, hastily made shields. Others practice with sticks, learning how to move in formation, how to keep a line, how to work as a group rather than as individuals. Veterans of earlier campaigns, grey-haired men who fought in Spain or under Hannibal's command, step into the role of instructors. They correct grips, adjust stances, lecture about discipline, about holding your position even when your instinct screams at you to run. Women organise their own efforts. Some train with slings on the outskirts of the city, sending stones thudding into wooden targets. Others join teams tasked with sewing bandages, grinding grain, hauling water to high points on the walls where cisterns are being filled against the possibility that wells will be fouled. Children watch all of this with wide eyes. For them, the siege is still half game, half thrilling spectacle. They race to carry messages, volunteer to watch from tower tops and run down to report any change in the Roman camp. In a few months, perhaps in a few weeks, they will understand much more clearly what they are part of. Religious life shifts too. Temples that were once centres of civic display become centres of collective anxiety and resolve. Priests call for fasting, for offerings, for public rites meant to secure the favour of Baal Hammon, of Tanit, of other deities whose names are mostly lost to us now. People crowd into sanctuaries, bringing whatever they can spare: oil, wine, small figurines, jewellery. Some vow to dedicate spoils from imagined future victories. Others simply beg for their families to be spared. It would be easy from outside to dismiss this as superstition, but inside the city ritual has a practical function. It focuses fear. It gives people a sense, however fragile, that they are not merely at the mercy of Roman machines and generals, but that they can still act, appeal, participate in something larger than themselves. Day by day, the preparations add up. New barricades appear in narrow streets leading to key squares, ready to be thrown up if the outer defences fall. Hidden passageways between houses are opened or dug, allowing movement even under missile fire. Cisterns are lined and sealed. Extra buckets are stored on rooftops in case of fire. From the Roman camp, none of this is obvious in detail. What they can see, as their engineers sketch the outline of the city and their officers walk the lines, is something simpler. No gates swinging open, no stream of refugees filing out with hands raised, no signs of hurried abandonment. Inside those walls, Carthage is not acting like a city that expects to survive by yielding. It is acting like a city that expects to be tested to destruction and has decided collectively to stretch that test as long as humanly possible. The Romans have come expecting a quick conclusion backed by overwhelming force, a moral tale that will warn others about defying their decrees. What they will find instead is a population that has already absorbed the worst possible news and in the face of it has chosen to work, to organize, to fight. The outcome, in strategic terms, may never have been in doubt, but the path to that outcome, the months and years that follow this moment of frantic, determined preparation, will not look like the tidy, efficient erasure Rome had imagined when its consuls first sailed toward the African coast. The Romans arrive as they always do, with tents, trenches, and an almost comforting sense of inevitability. From the heights above the plain, their camp spreads out in straight lines, a geometry of conquest. Ditches are cut, ramparts thrown up, streets laid out. Within days, a small portable version of Rome exists on the doorstep of Carthage. But when their scouts ride closer to survey the ground, they see something that makes them frown. This is not an easy city. Carthage does not sit helplessly in the open, waiting to be wrapped in a noose. It occupies a tongue of land jutting into the sea, protected on 3 sides by water, and on the 4th by fortifications that were not designed by optimists. To the north, the ground rises toward a low ridge, the Bursa Hill, where the upper city and temples command a wide view. From there, the land slopes down in terraces, thick with houses, workshops, and walls. Out toward the plain, the great landward fortification runs in a long arc, a massive stone wall with towers, ditches, and an interior fighting platform broad enough to march troops along its length. To the east and south, the coastline curls around shallow bays and artificial basins. The merchant harbour opens toward the sea, an inviting crescent. Behind it, hidden from a distant observer, lies the Kothan, the circular military harbour, with its inner island, shipsheds, and arsenal. From the Roman perspective, this is a fortress surrounded by moats of salt water. You can dig trenches, build rams, and assault walls, but how do you strangle a city that can still breathe through its harbours? The first Roman commanders of the war, the consuls who opened the siege, discover very quickly that numbers alone won't solve that question. On land, they begin in the usual way. Engineers walk the line of the walls, measuring distances, estimating heights, noting gates, towers, and terrain. They choose positions for their camps where they can watch the main approaches but still reach water and supplies. They start to cut the city off from its hinterland, burning fields, destroying nearby villages, driving off anyone found outside the walls. Then the more technical work begins. Siege towers are ordered. Tall wooden structures, built in sections, each level filled with archers and slingers, fronted with rawhide to resist fire. Battering rams are assembled, suspended from heavy frames, their iron-shod heads carved to bite at stone. Workers fell trees, strip branches, shape timbers. Carpenters who have never seen Carthage before find themselves building machines meant to touch walls they can only glimpse on the horizon. Every nail, every rope, every plank has to be brought here by ship or overland caravan. It's a vast effort. But in the first months it is also disorganized. The early Roman assaults on Carthage are marked in the sources by overconfidence and poor coordination. Some attempts are launched before supply lines are secure. Others falter because rival Roman commanders focus more on their own prestige than on coherent strategy. Inside the city, Carthage notices. The defenders watch as siege engines roll forward imperfectly shielded, as cohorts attempt escalades without proper cover, as Roman lines get bogged down in the outer ditches. They are frightened, yes, but also grimly encouraged. This enemy can be made to bleed. On the walls, Carthaginian engineers and archers go to work. Stones are stockpiled in great heaps. Slingers and bowmen take positions behind crenellations, ready to pick off exposed crews driving rams. Catapults, rebuilt from scavenged parts, hurl rocks and jars of incendiaries at advancing towers. When a Roman siege engine gets too close, teams on the ramparts use hooks and chains to grab its superstructure, trying to drag it off balance or pull away protective screens. Carthage fights back with what it has always relied on: ships and fire. Roman admirals know they have to close the sea. They bring their fleets around the headlands, anchoring in lines meant to block the harbour mouths. Chains are stretched between some ships. Patrols watch the horizon for any sign of blockade runners. On paper, it should work. Roman naval power has grown immense since the early days of its wars with Carthage. Their quinqueremes and triremes are built on standardized plans. Their crews are drilled. Their commanders have experience choking off Greek and Latin ports. But they are facing a city built for maritime tricks. The old treaty that limited Carthaginian warships has forced ingenuity. In the early phase of the siege, while Rome is still settling in, Carthaginian shipwrights in the Kothon complete a quiet revolution. Behind the outer ring of buildings, they reopen an old exit, a canal leading from the military harbour out to the sea at a point the Romans have not fully secured. They widen and deepen it in frantic secrecy, working at night, muffling blows, hauling spoil in covered carts. For months, Roman scouts see only what they expect, a main harbour strongly guarded by Roman ships. They do not realise that an alternative throat is being cut through the land, just out of sight. The day the new outlet opens, the balance of the siege feels briefly as if it might tilt. Carthage launches a fleet of freshly prepared warships, many of them hybrid constructions patched together from whatever could float. Their crews are not the seasoned mariners of earlier Punic wars, but they are determined and they know the local waters intimately. The ships burst from the hidden channel into open sea, oars biting foam, prows cutting lines toward the Roman blockading force. What follows is less a tidy naval battle than a desperate, chaotic clash. Roman captains scramble to form their squadrons. Some ships manage to interpose. Others are caught out of position, forced to fight in smaller packets. Carthaginian rams find a few targets. Boarding actions erupt as marines leap across railings, shields up, blades out. For hours the battle surges. At the end of the day, Roman seamanship and numbers reassert themselves. The makeshift Punic fleet cannot match the disciplined weight of the Roman navy. Several Carthaginian ships go down. Others, battered and burning, limp back toward the harbour. But the psychological effect is immense. From the walls and hills, the people of Carthage have seen their city reach out, strike at the blockade, prove that it is not yet sealed in a tomb. Stories spread through the streets about individual acts of bravery. A pilot who steered his vessel between two opposing rams, an oarsman who kept rowing with an arrow through his arm, a young marine who held a Roman boarding party at bay long enough for his comrades to escape. The Romans take their own lesson. They realise that this siege will not simply be a matter of waiting and token attacks. Carthage is capable of sudden, dangerous sorties by land and sea. Any gap in the encirclement can become a wound. The Senate responds by sending someone who, in later memory, will be inseparable from the city's fate. Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus. He arrives not as a novice, but carrying a famous name. His adoptive grandfather, Scipio Africanus, defeated Hannibal at Zama. His family has a history with Carthage written in battles and treaties, yet the man who comes to take command is not just a symbol. He's also a soldier who has already proven himself in Spain. Scipio walks the lines quietly. He talks to centurions, to engineers, to allied princes. He listens to complaints about shortages, discipline, confusion in previous assaults. He visits the sea camp, notes where ships lie, where patrols are lax, where coordination between land and navy is broken down. Then he begins to tighten things. The Roman camp is reorganized with an almost obsessive focus on order. Foragers who once wandered too far are reined in. Looting and lax discipline, which had sapped morale and angered allied contingents, are cracked down on. Scipio re-establishes harsh training routines, punishes slackness, rewards reliability. Most importantly, he changes the goal from a series of spectacular assaults to a slow, relentless squeeze. He orders the construction of a massive circumvallation, a continuous line of fortifications encircling the landward approaches to Carthage. It is an enormous undertaking. Ditches, ramparts, palisades, watchtowers, all built under the threat of sorties from the city. Roman soldiers dig while their comrades stand guard with shields locked, watching the walls for any sign of a breakout. Night after night, campfires mark the growing ring, a necklace of flame tightening around Carthage's throat. At the same time, Scipio works with the admirals to refine the naval blockade. Anchorage positions are adjusted so that no obvious gaps remain. Additional ships are stationed near the newly discovered harbour outlet. Fireships and rafts are prepared to be sent against any structure the Carthaginians might try to extend into the water. Patrols become more regular, less subject to individual whim. Inside Carthage, the effects of this slow constriction begin to accumulate. Supply runs that once slipped through at night now find Roman pickets on unexpected shores. Fishermen who dared to cast nets under the lee of the outer walls are driven back or captured. Land routes are effectively gone. Neighbouring towns have already fallen to Rome or chosen to side with a stronger power. Food that once came in as a trickle now slows further. The defenders do not simply accept this. They launch counter-sallies against the Roman lines, especially where the circumvallation is still under construction. Small groups of picked fighters, guided by people who know every fold of the terrain, slip out at night, hit working parties, set fire to timbers, and rush back under covering fire from the walls. Sometimes these attacks succeed, burning days of labour in an hour. Sometimes they are met by prepared cohorts, and the dark outside the city fills with screams and the dull thud of bodies. On the sea, Carthaginian crews attempt smaller, more targeted operations. A handful of fast boats run the blockade on moonless nights, trying to bring in grain from sympathetic coastal communities. Others attempt to harass isolated Roman transports, hoping to disrupt the supply chain that keeps the besiegers fed. Every such effort carries terrible risk. Capture can mean slavery or death, yet people volunteer, driven by the knowledge that each sack of grain, each ship delayed, buys a little more time. Time, however, is slowly turning against Carthage. Scipio's ring on land grows more solid. Roman ships learn the rhythm of local currents, the tricks of Carthaginian pilots. Diseases and shortages begin to eat at both sides, but the Romans have wider resources to draw upon. Fresh troops, new supplies, reinforcements from allies who want to be on the winning side. From the walls, the people of Carthage look out and see not just an army, but a system settling in around them. Lines of wagons coming and going from the Roman rear areas, herds of animals brought in to feed the legions, fresh cohorts marching in, replacing units thinned by battle and sickness. New siege engines appearing, taller and better protected than the last wave that burned under Punic missiles. They also see something else, a pattern in Roman behaviour that speaks of a single will now guiding operations. Attacks on one sector of the wall are suddenly coordinated with feints elsewhere. Naval demonstrations off the harbour coincide with land probes, forcing defenders to divide attention. The siege is no longer a series of disconnected efforts by ambitious consuls. It feels like a methodical, purposeful pressure applied from all sides. Days blur into weeks, weeks into months. The fields beyond the walls lie fallow and burnt, a grey-brown scar. The once busy roads that led inland are now little more than tracks between Roman fortlets and picket posts. The sea, which used to carry Carthaginian merchants to Spain, Sicily and beyond, is dotted instead with the silhouettes of Roman ships, their masts a forest of foreign power. The city has not fallen, its walls still stand. Its harbours, though watched, are not fully dead. But each year of siege adds another invisible weight to the balance. Somewhere in his headquarters, Scipio Aemilianus is surely keeping count of rations, of casualties, of days. Inside Carthage, others are doing the same, though perhaps with more dread. The siege by land and sea has become less like a single event and more like a climate, an enclosing weather of hunger, fear and grinding labour that presses inward, closer, waiting for the moment when something, somewhere along those walls, will finally give way. In the third year of that enclosing weather, something does give way. It doesn't happen with a thunderclap or a single dramatic assault. It begins, instead, with a series of small calculations on wax tablets in the Roman camp, and with human bodies in Carthage growing thinner, weaker, less able to stand watch through the night. Scipio and his officers study the walls the way hunters study tracks. They know by now which sectors are still vigorously defended and which are quieter, where patrols on the ramparts pass like clockwork, and where gaps in the pattern have begun to appear. Messengers bring word of intercepted rumours, shortages in a particular district, arguments among Carthaginian commanders, cracks not in the masonry but in morale. Eventually all those observations coalesce into a plan. The Romans will not try to knock down the entire city at once. They will drive a wedge. The chosen target is near the harbours, along the sea wall that protects the merchant basin, and the channel leading toward the Cothon. It is an area that has seen less constant pressure than the main landward fortifications, but its fall would be catastrophic. Seize the harbour quarter, drive inward from there, and you can split Carthage in half, separate defenders on the Bursa hill from those clinging to the shoreline and the shipyards. Under cover of darkness, Roman engineers move forward with a deliberate quiet. Earthworks that have been rising for weeks are finished, their tops levelled to form platforms. Siege towers, assembled piece by piece behind the lines, are rolled closer, their wheels muffled with rawhide and packed earth. Battering rams creep into position under bulbous protective sheds that glisten with fresh wetted hides to resist fire. Dawn on the day of the final breach looks, at first, like so many other siege mornings. Grey light seeping over the plain, the faint clink of armour, the low murmur of orders drifting along the Roman lines. Inside Carthage, people wake after fitful sleep, if they slept at all. They count remaining loaves. They listen to the distant rumble outside the walls and try to decide whether it sounds different today. Then the signal is given. Trumpets sound along the Roman front, not in a scattered, overlapping fashion, but in a coordinated roll, section after section. Siege engines begin to move. Behind them, cohorts form up in dense, ordered blocks, shields overlapping, pillar-angled like a metal field. The assault on the harbour walls comes like a tightening fist. Catapults hurl stones and bolts at the parapets, aiming for anyone who shows a head above the crenellations. Archers release clouds of arrows, trying to clear the ramparts long enough for the lumbering towers to close the last exposed distance. On the walls, Carthaginian defenders scramble into place. Many of them are not professional soldiers. Some are merchants who once traded in Spanish silver, artisans whose hands are better suited for chisels and dies, teenagers who grew up watching ships in the Cothon and never imagined they would be hurling stones at an enemy from their own rooftops. They take their positions anyway. Baskets of rocks and tiles are dragged forward. Javelins and spears are passed hand to hand. As the towers approach, the defenders do what they have done for 2 years. They reach for fire. Pots of pitch and oil, wrapped in cloth, are lit and lobbed downward. Some shatter on the ground, sputtering uselessly. Others smash against the hides and wooden faces of the towers, dripping flame. But Roman engineers have learned from earlier losses. The rawhide coverings are thicker now, kept soaked by teams of water carriers working in relay. Flame crawls and smokes, but it does not immediately catch. Rams begin their work. The sound is dull but insistent. Iron caps kissing stone, withdrawing, striking again in a slow, relentless rhythm. Each blow sends a shiver up the wall, a faint tremor under the feet of those standing above. Carthaginian archers lean out to shoot at the men under the ramsheds, but the angles are poor and Roman counterfire is deadly. Every time a defender lingers too long at a crenel, a stone or arrow finds them. Hours stretch. The sun climbs. Dust hangs over the harbour quarter in a pale, shimmering veil. In that grit-filled air, it is hard to see where precisely the turning point comes. Perhaps it is when a single tower finally grinds up flush against the wall, its drawbridge thumping down onto the parapet. Perhaps it is when one battered section of masonry, pounded for hours, gives up a vertical crack that widens with each impact of the ram. Some ancient accounts speak of a partial collapse near the harbour, a section of wall that simply could not bear the cumulative strain any longer. Whether it fell all at once or in great chunks, the effect would have been the same, a breach wide enough to draw men through. Roman trumpets sound again, a higher, sharper note. Cohorts surge forward, funneled toward the gap. Ladders slap against still-standing segments of wall. The first men to climb know, with a clarity that needs no words, that their chances of coming back down alive are not high. but they also know how Rome remembers the first soldier over an enemy wall. For the defenders, the breach is not an abstract term anymore. It's a very real hole, full of dust and tumbling stone, through which enemy shapes begin to appear, shields, helmets, the glint of spear points. The defence shifts in an instant from linear to improvised. There is no more neat line of battle along the parapet. Now there is a scramble to plug a wound. Streets nearest the harbour wall become killing grounds. Carthaginian commanders, many of them nobles who have traded their fine clothes for cuirasses and helmets, try to throw together ad hoc barricades, overturned carts, stacked amphorae, anything that can slow a Roman advance coming off the wall. Fighters are pulled from other sectors, from rooftop posts, from whatever reserve still exists. Orders blur into shouted pleas. When the Romans break through in numbers, they find themselves not in open ground, but in a dense urban maze. Narrow lanes, blind corners, stairways vanishing between tall houses. It is nothing like the drill yards outside the city where centurions barked commands and formations wheeled on clean flat earth. Here, formations fracture almost at once. A cohort that poured through the breach as a disciplined block splinters into half cohorts and maniple-sized groups as it encounters the geometry of streets. Small units push forward, guided by officers who have only the vaguest sense of the city's layout. They know the general direction they are supposed to move, toward the harbours, toward the inner districts, but each turn can reveal an unexpected obstacle or a volley of missiles from above. From windows and rooftops, Carthaginians fight the way urban defenders always have when larger forces push into their streets. Stones, tiles, and fragments of masonry rain down. Javelins dart from shadowed doorways. There are ambushes at corners, quick thrusts from short spears, then sudden retreats into alleys too narrow for Roman shields to turn. Roman soldiers adapt as best they can. They angle their scooter overhead in improvised testudo shapes to protect against the rain from above, then surge forward in bursts. Some homes are stormed simply because they provide firing positions against the street. Doors are broken. Interiors that once held household shrines and storage jars become temporary fortlets, occupied for an hour, then abandoned as the fight rolls past. The harbour quarter is crucial. Control it, and the Romans can finally choke what little life remains in Carthage's maritime lungs. The merchant basin, with its curved quays and warehouses, becomes a secondary battlefield. Ships half rotted in their berths, their crews long since diverted to man the walls, now serve as shields and obstacles. Fighting spills along the waterfront, between sheds once full of grain and merchandise. Some Carthaginian defenders, seeing Roman helmets among the harbour buildings, set fire to supplies rather than let them be captured. Smoke adds another layer of confusion, turning the salt tang of the sea thick and bitter. Behind the merchant harbour lies the Cothon, the circular military basin that once displayed Carthaginian naval power like an armoury on water. By the final year of the siege, many of its ship sheds stand empty or gutted. But the structure still matters. Its inner island, ringed with slips and workshops, forms a natural redoubt. Carthaginian fighters fall back onto it, using the curved outer ring as a defensive perimeter. Roman units try to force their way in along the narrow connecting causeways and between warehouses that clog the approaches. In the crush around the Cothon and the adjoining military quarter, the very qualities that once made Carthage formidable now shape the fight. The specialized facilities, arsenals, rope walks, foundries, provide solid, defensible structures, but also choke points where a handful of determined defenders can stall larger numbers. Close quarters combat here is brutal and confusing. Men lose track of where they are in relation to the rest of the city. Sound reflects strangely off water and stone. Commands echo or vanish in the clamour. Somewhere amidst this chaos, the Carthaginian command realises a hard truth. The lower city and harbour districts can no longer be held as a coherent defensive line. The Romans are inside the outer shell. No single counterattack will throw them back to the breach. The logic of defence shifts again from trying to save the whole city to saving what can be saved for as long as possible. The order goes out, whether formally through runners or informally through the obvious pressure on the ground, to fall back toward the upper city, toward the mass of the Byrsa hill. Civilians stream upward alongside fighters. Families clutching what few possessions they can carry try to move ahead of the Roman advance, crowding stairways and terraces that lead toward the citadel. Temples and public buildings on the slopes of Byrsa begin to fill with the displaced. Streets that were already narrow feel suffocating now. Voices blend into a constant anxious roar. Behind them, Roman units consolidate what they have taken. Strongpoints are established in the harbour quarter. Guards are left at critical intersections, at the mouths of streets leading back toward the breach. But Scipio's officers understand the opportunity before them. The enemy is not surrendering. It is compressing. If pressed now, the retreat could be turned into a rout, or at least into a fight that pins Carthaginian strength in a smaller, more containable space. So the Romans climb. They push upward through layers of the city, house by house, block by block, always with Byrsa rising ahead, a bulky looming silhouette against the afternoon light. The terraces that once gave residents views of ships and open sea now give archers lines of fire down onto advancing foreigners. Every landing, every stair, every flat rooftop becomes another tiny front. For those on the Carthaginian side, the experience of collapse is not a single moment, but a series of realizations. The familiar quarter where they bought fish is suddenly full of Romans. The street that led to the family workshop is cut off by a shield wall. The harbour, which for generations promised escape and connection to the wider world, is now a battlefield littered with bodies and shattered timbers. Terror in such moments is not loud and cinematic. It is the dry taste in the back of the throat as you realise there is nowhere else to run but uphill. It is the numb slowness with which someone turns to help an elderly parent up another flight of steps while hearing, behind them, the alien cadence of Latin commands getting closer. By nightfall, large parts of the lower city and the harbour installations are in Roman hands, or at least under Roman spears. Fires, set deliberately or sparked by the fighting, smoulder in several districts, sending columns of smoke that hang over the water and drift inland. The Kothon, once a wheel of ordered activity, gleams dark and strange under the haze, its military importance finally nullified not by blockades or treaties, but by enemy feet on its stone quays. The shape of the siege has changed. It is no longer Rome outside and Carthage within. Rome is now inside the skin of the city, moving through its veins. What remains of Carthaginian power gathers on the last high ground. On the crest and slopes of the Byrsa, walls within walls are hastily reinforced. Barricades thicken across access roads. Temples are stripped of metal to forge more weapons. Any terrace that offers a field of fire is prepared as a defensive line. The citadel, long the symbolic heart of Carthage, is becoming its final redoubt. For 3 years the city has been strangling slowly. With the breach and the fall of the harbour quarter, the slow suffocation gives way to something sharper. Carthage is no longer trying to outlast an encirclement. It is preparing to make a last stand on a hill crowded with the living, the wounded, the desperate, and the few remaining fighters who still believe that as long as Byrsa stands, their city is not yet entirely dead. The next phase does not begin with a clear official announcement. No one posts a notice saying, "Now the 17 days start." Later writers will give it that shape, a clean frame around a messy horror. On the ground it begins more simply, with exhaustion and the decision not to stop. Night falls after the breach. In many sieges, that would be the moment when attackers pull back, count their dead, reset lines. In Carthage, the fighting breathes but does not fully sleep. Skirmishes flare in the half-light of burning warehouses. Roman officers send messages up the line. Scipio listens, measures, decides. The harbour and lower city are shattered but not quiet. Yet he knows that momentum once gained is a fragile thing. If he allows a full pause, the defenders on Byrsa will have time to dig in even deeper. So the pressure continues. Not a wild, continuous charge, but a grinding, methodical advance, upslope, into density. This is where the traditional 17 days begins, the final reduction of the upper city, the slow, deliberate erasure of resistance, street by street and house by house. Ancient sources compress it into a stark number, 17, as if someone was keeping careful track, scratching marks into a tablet each dawn. Maybe they were. Maybe it is more a rhetorical way of saying it went on and on, longer than anyone thought a final act could last. Modern historians reading those lines are cautious. Some think the count may be approximate, or that different phases of the final assault were telescoped into a neat span. But even the skeptics agree on the underlying reality. For well over a week, perhaps for more than 2, Carthage's last hill became a furnace that burned day and night. The Romans do not simply rush Bursa. That would be wasteful. Instead, they work their way upward like miners cutting galleries through rock. A line of houses here, a crooked alley there. Every building becomes both obstacle and opportunity. The standard formation that served them well on open plains is almost useless in this vertical maze. Centurions adapt. They divide their men into small assault teams, one group to force doors, another to guard stairwells, a third to watch roofs and neighbouring windows for missiles. Shields, designed to form broad walls in level fields, become individual shells to manoeuvre through doorways barely wide enough for 2 people. Carthaginian defenders use every advantage the built environment offers. They have had time, in the long years of siege, to think about which structures overlook which routes, which courtyards can funnel an enemy into killing zones. A doorway left invitingly open might have a barricade of furniture and spearmen just beyond the first dark turn. A silent, empty-looking roof might have a hatch in the centre, where a man can pop up, hurl a javelin, then vanish again before arrows can find him. When Romans break into a house, they often find not a static barricade, but a layered retreat. The outer room defended briefly, then abandoned for the stair. Another stand at the landing, another at the rooftop access. Sometimes the family that lives there is intermingled with the fighters. An old man in the corner clutching a small idol, a child clinging to a mother's robe as she tries to hold a shield. There is no clean line between combatant and civilian in such spaces. The people who once cooked meals in these hearths and swept these floors have nowhere else to go. Ancient accounts talk of 3, 4, even 6 stories of houses piled on the slopes of Bursa, narrow and tall. Archaeology suggests that some buildings there were indeed multi-storied, packed tight, with upper rooms overhanging the streets. In the final days, those height differences turn every advance into a layered threat. A Roman soldier climbing a stair knows that above him, unseen hands may be tipping stones off a roof, or sloshing pots of oil, or simply waiting with a spear held low, ready to thrust as soon as his helmet crests the final steps. The solution for the attackers is brutal. When a line of houses proves too stubborn, when losses to missiles and sudden ambushes mount, orders go out. Don't just clear them, remove them. Fire becomes a tool of tactics as much as terror. Romans set torches to door frames. They throw bundles of kindling into the lower stories. They use oil and pitch captured from storehouses, turning household timber into fuel. Once flames take hold in one house, they spread to its neighbours. Walls shared, beams interlocked. The wind that slides up the slope fans sparks from window to window. Smoke thickens into a curtain that hides everything beyond a few paces. Later writers, like Appian, speak with grim fascination of entire blocks burning while people still fought on their roofs. He describes men slipping on blood and ash, of beams collapsing under both defenders and attackers, of spaces where no one could see who they were striking. Modern readers sometimes suspect exaggeration here, an ancient historian leaning into drama. But we know what dense, flammable cities can do under bombardment and flame. We have seen photographs from far later wars where neighbourhoods become single, seething pyres. Carthage's last days likely had that same quality. Confused, smoky, with violence happening half by touch and sound. As the Romans clear upward, a pattern emerges. They seize a block, force out or kill the defenders, then deliberately destroy the structures or turn them into their own strong points. Behind them, the slope becomes a jagged scar of burned-out shells and open spaces. Ahead of them, the remaining Carthaginian-held area shrinks, compressing people into an ever-tighter knot at the summit. The human pressure there becomes unbearable. Every day, more civilians are pushed into the uppermost terraces and plazas. Temples, once tall and airy with columns and courtyards, fill with bodies and bundles. Storerooms swell with the displaced. Water access grows precarious. The smell of sweat, fear, and smoke seeps into every surface. Ancient writers, with their fondness for round numbers, speak of hundreds of thousands killed or enslaved in the fall of Carthage. Many modern scholars think the surviving population at the end was smaller, perhaps in the tens of thousands, rather than the extravagant figures of Roman rhetoric. But whatever the exact number, the experience for each individual was absolute. If you were a child clutching your mother's hand on Bursa, or an old woman pressed against the wall of a packed temple, it did not matter whether there were 40,000 of you or 200,000. The feeling was the same, being trapped on an island of stone while fire and iron ate their way toward you. Some civilians try to bargain with their circumstances in small ways. Those with a bit of wealth left may hide jewellery or small idols in cracks in the walls, in cisterns, under floor tiles. They might imagine that if anyone survives, these things can be retrieved, or perhaps they are simply refusing to let everything visible be taken by strangers. Archaeologists centuries later will find some of these caches and see in them the outline of that last, desperate calculus. Others turn their attention inward, to last rites. Priests in the crowded sanctuaries perform rituals as best they can, cut short by noise and by lack of proper tools. Animals for sacrifice are scarce. Perhaps offerings become more symbolic, more improvised. Parents whisper prayers over sleeping or sick children, invoking gods they fear are no longer listening. A few, according to later accounts, choose a more final devotion, locking themselves in temples and setting them alight rather than falling into enemy hands. How often this happened is unclear. It fits a pattern of noble suicide stories that Roman authors like to tell about defeated foes. But that some extreme acts of self-destruction occurred in this pressure cooker of flame and fear seems plausible. For the Romans moving upward through this tightening space, the emotional landscape is complex. They are not a faceless machine. Among them are men who have been in the trenches for 3 years, who have buried friends outside these walls, who have endured hunger and disease in the siege camps. Some feel cold satisfaction, a sense that this is the long-promised reckoning for Hannibal's march through Italy, for generations of rivalry. Others, confronted with the raw immediacy of screaming children and burning houses, feel something closer to unease. Ancient accounts preserve glimpses of this ambivalence. One story, told of Scipio himself, has him standing on a height overlooking the burning city, tears in his eyes, quoting lines about the fall of Troy and reflecting that one day such a fate might come for Rome. Whether or not he actually said those precise words, the anecdote captures a mood. The realization that what they were doing here was not just winning a war, but pulling up an entire civilization by the roots. Day follows, day in this grim rhythm, advance, encounter resistance, fighting close, choking spaces, set fire, move to the next line. The number 17, when you count it out slowly, is long, more than 2 weeks of waking to smoke, to the sound of collapsing masonry, to the knowledge that the territory in which you can possibly remain alive is smaller today than it was yesterday. By the time the Romans reach the crest of Byrsa, the city below is no longer really a city. It is a series of blackened gaps and still burning clusters, the plan of streets erased in places by charred emptiness. On the summit, in the final concentration of people, the last choices are being made. Who fights to the last? Who tries to slip down some unguarded slope under cover of smoke? Who walks trembling toward the lines of Romans with hands raised, gambling that captivity is better than death? Numbers again become slippery here, Roman authors claim that 50,000 Carthaginians were taken alive and sold into slavery when the city finally fell. Modern scholars treat that figure with caution, but not outright dismissal. Slave markets in the Mediterranean were hungry, and victors had every incentive to turn survivors into profit. Whether there were 20,000 or 50, the scene would have been horrifying. Lines of people herded together, families split, names shouted and written down by men who spoke a different language. What is not in doubt is that most of those who survived the flames did not walk away free. The 17 days of fire did not end with an amnesty. They ended with binding cords, with brands and sales and transport to estates and mines, and households scattered across Rome's widening world. Behind those living chains, behind the noise of marching captives and the final crackle of dying fires, something quieter settles over the hill. The last cries fade, embers cool. Walls that stood for centuries are now heaps of dust and tumbled blocks. Whatever else Rome chooses to do with this place, one thing is completed during those days. Carthage, as a living political community, as a city where children play and traders haggle, and priests watch the sunrise from temple steps, has been extinguished. Later, Roman historians will condense this extinction into phrases razed to the ground, left a desert. Archaeology suggests the reality was more complicated. Not every stone was thrown down, not every field salted, not every structure obliterated. Life would continue on parts of this site under Roman rule in the decades and centuries to come. But for the people who lived through those 17 days, nuance does not matter. What they experienced was total loss, an ending so thorough that only stories and ruins would remain to hint at what once stood here. The hill of Byrsa, emptied now of its last defenders and stripped of its crowded, desperate shelters, stands bare under the sky. In the distance, the sea that once carried Carthaginian ships glitters as if nothing has happened. But below the surface, in the layers of ash and broken pottery and charred beams, the memory of those days is written into the earth itself, waiting for future ages to wonder what, exactly, Rome destroyed when it spent 17 days letting a city burn. When the fires finally die down and the last captives are marched away, it's tempting to imagine that what vanished with Carthage was just a city. One name erased from the map, a dot on a coastline replaced by another dot, under different management. But Carthage was not simply a dot. It was the loudest voice of a much wider Punic world, and what Rome crushed in 146 was both narrower and broader than the old phrase "destroyed Carthage" suggests. Start by thinking about all the things that never made it out of those flames. Somewhere in that burned-out upper city there were archives, not just tax lists and harbour accounts, but treaties, correspondence, legal codes, property records, perhaps philosophical treatises, religious commentaries, technical manuals. We know this because Rome, in earlier negotiations, demanded that Carthage turn over certain records. We know it because surviving fragments of Punic writing quoted by hostile outsiders mention older authorities and traditions. You don't cite the old law or the temple records unless you have shelves or chests where such things live. Those shelves are gone. No Punic equivalent of Livy's history or Polybius's analysis came down to us. We have no Carthaginian general's memoirs of the wars with Rome, no merchant's diary describing storms off Sardinia, no priest's reflections on what sacrifices meant. When we talk about Carthage now, we mostly speak with voices that watched it burn from the outside. The same is true for institutions. A city like Carthage doesn't run on sheer momentum. It has councils, courts, offices, formal and informal ways of deciding who speaks for whom. Greek observers admired Carthage's constitution. Aristotle, writing long before the final war, compared its structures to those of well-governed Greek states and praised the way it balanced elite power and wider participation. Later Roman authors sneer at suffet and hundreds and fours, titles and councils that made no sense in Latin but mattered to Carthaginians. Those titles don't outlive the siege. When the Romans are done, there are no more suffets convening in stone halls, no more senate assemblies arguing over whether to risk a fleet, no more city officials regulating trade in the inner harbour. Punic foreign policy dies here, not just because the city's gone, but because the entire machinery for making collective decisions is dismantled. So do the elite networks that connected the Punic world. If you were a great merchant of Carthage, your power didn't stop at the city gates. It stretched across the sea, through kin and in-laws in other Phoenician-founded towns, through client communities inland, through deals with Numidian kings. Slaves moved along those lines. So did grain, purple dye, silver, timber, ideas. A word from a Carthaginian councillor could redirect a trade convoy or call in a favour from a distant ally. When Scipio's men move across Byrsa, when they kill some families outright and sell others piecemeal into slavery, those invisible lines fray and snap. A cousin in Gades or a partner in Sardinia may still remember the old arrangements. But the central node that coordinated them, that sent letters sealed with certain signet rings, is gone. The network collapses not because everyone in it dies, but because its hub is removed. Temples fall with those institutions. Not every sanctuary in the city is wrecked down to the last brick. Archaeology suggests a more uneven destruction, with some sacred sites later reused or built over. But as active centres of Punic cult, as places where specific rites were performed by specific lineages for specific gods, they are finished. Priests die in the fighting or vanish into slavery. Ritual objects are looted or melted down. Cultic calendars, when to fast, when to feast, what verse to recite at which festival, go into the flames with the tablets and scrolls. Later, Romans will build their own temples on some of the same heights. New gods, or old gods with Latin names, will look out over the bay. Religious life will continue, but the chain of practice that once linked a fisherman's offering to a goddess of the sea or a magistrate's vow to Baal Hammon before a risky military expedition will have been broken. From this angle, Rome looks like a civilization killer. It burned the libraries, it dissolved the councils, it uprooted or scattered the ruling families who coordinated Punic power across 3 continents. It turned the old centre of that system into an example. Then the picture shifts, because not everything that made the Punic world Punic lived in archives and hilltop temples. Consider language. For centuries after 146, people in North Africa go on speaking Punic. Latin inscriptions admit this bluntly. They mention interpreters for Afri who speak Punic. They record Punic names rendered awkwardly in Roman letters. Church fathers writing much later complain that rural congregations prefer sermons in a Semitic tongue rather than in polished Latin. One Christian author, Augustine, notes that some local words used for God sound awfully like old names once given to a Carthaginian deity. This is not the silence of a wiped-out people. It's the murmur of a culture that has lost its capital but not its voice. Religion, too, shows threads of survival. The high, spectacular state cults that revolved around big Carthaginian temples are gone. Their altars are dark, but small local practices don't always stop when empires fall. Archaeologists find amulets, household shrines, symbols that blend Punic forms with Roman fashions. A protective sign once carved for Tanit might be scratched quietly into the lintel of a new, Roman-style house. A spring that was sacred before the war probably remains sacred after, even if the story told about its guardian spirit slowly changes. Agricultural knowledge is even harder to erase. The famous Roman agronomist Columella praises with some envy the skill of North African farmers in managing dry soils, rotating crops, grafting trees. Another writer claims to quote from a Carthaginian treatise on farming that the Romans supposedly translated and preserved. Whether that specific book existed or not, the larger pattern is clear. Roman landowners in Africa rely heavily on local expertise. They don't invent terrace walls or clever cisterns from nothing. They buy land that has already been coaxed into fertility by generations of Punic and Libyan hands, and often they keep those hands in place, now as tenants or labourers. When you walk, in your mind, out beyond the blackened stump of Carthage in 146, into the hills and plains that fed the city, life doesn't simply stop. Villages endure. Fields that escaped direct devastation still need to be sown. Herds still need to be moved to seasonal pastures. People there have their own memories, their own stories about Carthage. Admiration, resentment, dependence, maybe indifference. Rome's victory rearranges their lives, but it doesn't turn them into blank slates. What about the most famous detail of all? The idea that Rome sowed the land with salt so nothing would ever grow again? It's a powerful image. Conquerors walking slowly across ruined ground, scattering sterility with each step. For many modern readers, it has become part of the Carthage story, as real as Scipio's tears. Yet when historians go looking for it in ancient sources close to the event, they don't find it. The earliest clear references to salting Carthage's site are much later, part of a medieval and early modern tradition that loved moralizing symbols. In the text written by people who either lived through the war or talked to those who did, the destruction is fire and demolition, massacre and enslavement, not ritual salting. That doesn't mean Roman commanders were gentle with the land. They dismantled fortifications. They may have temporarily banned settlement on certain parts of the site. They certainly wanted to send a message. But the specific image of salting the earth around Carthage appears to be a later embroidery, a story people told to make a brutal act even more absolute in the imagination. In reality, Rome did something in some ways more unsettling. It didn't make the area a perpetual desert. It turned it into a different kind of heartland. Within a century, a new Roman Carthage begins to rise. Colonists arrive. Streets are laid out in sharp rectilinear grids, over and through older foundations. Public baths steam where Punic houses once crowded the slopes. An amphitheatre hosts games. Latin rescripts and edicts are posted where once Punic decrees were proclaimed. The countryside around this new city becomes one of the breadbaskets of the empire. Olive groves spread. Grain fills ship after ship, bound not for Carthaginian galleys but for Roman and Nona lists. Estates with thoroughly Roman names on their boundary stones may still employ workers whose grandparents prayed in Punic, and whose farming techniques predate both conquerors and conquered. So what, in the end, did Rome destroy in those 17 days? It did not erase every trace of Punic civilization. Language persisted. Local religious habits adapted and endured. Agricultural systems, trade skills, craft traditions carried on in altered forms, channeled into Roman frameworks. Even some families of Punic origin rose again under the new order, now as Romans from Africa. What Rome did extinguish was the possibility of a Punic-led world. It killed a capital city that could make war and peace, project power, and claim its own version of universal importance. It burned the libraries where Carthaginians wrote down their version of events. It scattered the aristocracies and councils that had, for centuries, steered a maritime empire in their own tongue. From then on, Punic voices survive mostly as echoes inside other people's stories or as faint inscriptions on stone. North Africa does not fall silent, but it speaks increasingly in Latin, under Roman rules, in Roman courts, to Roman gods. The ashes on Byrsa mark the end of Carthage as a rival centre of gravity. What rises after is not emptiness, but a transformed landscape. Roman Africa, built over and through the ruins of a civilization that fire could maim, but not entirely erase. Memory is not neutral. When the smoke cleared over Carthage, Rome did not just inherit a stretch of coastline and some good farmland. It inherited the story of what had happened there, and from very early on Roman writers began working on that story, shaping it into something useful. If you read the Roman accounts, a pattern emerges. Carthage is almost never allowed to be merely unfortunate or unlucky, or caught on the wrong side of history. It has to be guilty. Polybius, the Greek historian who watched the city burn from the Roman camp, is already edging in this direction. He knows Carthage had strengths worth admiring. He respects Hannibal as a strategist. He admits the Punic state was formidable. But when he comes to explain why Carthage fell, he leans on moral language, decay, corruption, greed. For Polybius, Rome wins not only because it is strong, but because it is, in some sense, more virtuous. Later, Roman authors will double down on that idea. In their hands, Carthage becomes a kind of negative mirror. Everything Rome wants to condemn, it puts into Punic mouths. Cowardice, treachery, luxury, impiety. Even when Romans grudgingly praise Carthaginian bravery, it is often framed as dangerous because it is not tempered by Roman discipline or Roman piety. The supposed child sacrifices at Carthage are the clearest example. Roman and Greek writers dwell on them with a fascination that feels almost obsessive. Whether all their claims were accurate, exaggerated, or weaponized horror, the rhetorical function is obvious. Here is a people so depraved that burning their city is not simply victory, it is purification. The war becomes not a contest between rival powers, but a crusade of civilization against barbarism. Once you see that move, you start to notice it everywhere. When Cato the Elder ends speeches with "Carthage must be destroyed," he isn't just making a strategic argument. He is also painting Rome as perpetually threatened. Carthage is cast as the lurking danger that justifies extraordinary measures. Fear becomes part of the story. Fear of Hannibal's memory, fear of economic competition, fear that Rome's hard-won virtue will soften if a rich rival is allowed to exist. After 146, that fear has to be reconciled with the reality that the threat is physically gone. The solution is simple. Carthage is recast as a warning. Livy, writing about earlier wars, lets Roman senators debate whether prosperity will corrupt them the way it supposedly corrupted Carthage. Moralists point to Punic wealth, Punic luxury, Punic effeminacy as cautionary tales. The message is not subtle. Rome must avoid becoming Carthage, even as it absorbs Carthage's lands and profits. Carthage's fall thus serves two purposes in Roman memory. It is a triumph, proof that Rome can annihilate a rival that once nearly strangled it. And it is a sermon, evidence that those who oppose Rome are always at some level morally deficient, and that Rome itself must guard against the same fate by staying pure. The result is that for centuries anyone reading about Carthage does so mostly through Roman eyes, even much later when medieval scholars copy Roman texts. When Renaissance humanists rediscover Polybius and Appian, they inherit Carthage as an already framed character. The city is the villain that got what it deserved, or the terrifying rival that Rome heroically overcame, or the decadent cautionary tale. Every so often, someone tries to complicate that picture. A Greek philosopher like Aristotle, centuries before the final war, writes about Carthage's constitution as a model of good governance. A Roman agronomist hints at Punic expertise he genuinely admires, but these are fragments, scattered remarks inside a much louder chorus. The chorus wins. By the time early modern Europe is debating empire and colonization, Carthage has become shorthand in political arguments. Some writers warn that new trading powers might become another Carthage, rich, mercantile, dangerous. Others compare their enemies to Carthage to justify harsh treatment. The Roman lens is still doing its work long after the empire itself has collapsed. The land under that lens, however, holds its own memory. Archaeology, in the last 2 centuries, has become a kind of quiet rebellion against the Roman narrative. Shovels and trowels, stratigraphic diagrams, and radiocarbon dates. These are not neutral tools either, but they allow different questions to be asked. When archaeologists dig in the harbour basins of ancient Carthage, they find not just military installations, but complex engineering. Quays, docks, warehouses, ship sheds. They see a community that understood logistics, storage, shipbuilding. It doesn't match the caricature of a greedy, short-sighted merchant city. It looks like long-term planning, collective investment, technical skill. In cemeteries and domestic quarters, they find everyday objects, jewellery, cooking pots, imported luxuries, local imitations. They see families living in multi-storey houses, with courtyards and cisterns, eating from plates, attending rituals, mourning their dead. The material record stubbornly insists that Carthaginians were not just antagonists in Roman dramas, but people with rich, ordinary, complicated lives. Even the most contested evidence, the so-called Tophet, the open-air precinct with urns containing the remains of young children and animals, gains nuance under archaeological scrutiny. Some researchers see confirmation of sacrifice, others argue for a cemetery for children who died naturally. The debate is fierce and unlikely to be fully settled. But the very existence of the debate breaks the old certainty. It reminds us that Rome's moralizing may not be a reliable guide to what Punic religion actually meant to its practitioners. Inscriptions help too, even the few that survive. Simple funerary texts in Punic, dedications to gods with names Rome tried to translate or overwrite, graffiti scratched by anonymous hands. All of these are small acts of speech pushing back against historical silence. They don't give us a Livy or a Polybius from the Carthaginian side, but they do show us a city where people wrote, counted, vowed, remembered, in their own words. Step back, and a pattern appears that is larger than Carthage. Empires rarely stop at tearing down walls. They also work on the ruins of meaning. Physical destruction is immediate, noisy, visible. Memory work is slower, often quieter, but just as deliberate. Why? Because a rival that has been thoroughly discredited in memory is safer. If Carthage can be fixed in the Roman imagination as cruel, faithless, decadent, then future Romans need not wrestle with the discomforting fact that they annihilated a sophisticated, law-governed, creative city. They don't have to ask whether different choices were possible. The verdict has already been written. They did what had to be done. Erasing a rival's own voice serves a second purpose. Rome can now speak for Carthage, or instead of it. When later Roman Africa prospers, that success is credited to Roman order and Roman law, not to older systems that prepared the ground. When North African intellectuals write in Latin, they are counted as Roman thinkers, even if their ancestry runs back through Punic and Libyan lines. Silence is not just the absence of sound. It is often the result of someone turning down the volume on inconvenient voices. Carthage's absence from its own story is an example of that. So are many other vanished capitals in other times and places, whose archives went up in flames, whose chronicles were never copied, whose gods were renamed and folded into conquering pantheons. Fear is always somewhere in the background. Fear of competition, fear of retaliation, fear that your own power is more fragile than it looks. Rome, for all its confidence, remembered the 20 years when Hannibal prowled Italy, when senators debated abandoning the city, when allies wavered. That trauma doesn't evaporate just because the legions eventually win. It seeks reassurance. One kind of reassurance is visible: a broken enemy city, a ploughed-over citadel, a colony of your own citizens planted on the same spot. Another kind is narrative. Histories that emphasize your destiny, your virtues, the inevitability of your victory. Both kinds work together to calm the old anxiety, but the ashes don't always stay quiet. As modern readers, we live at a distance from those fears. We can look back and see, more clearly than Romans often did, how much was lost when Carthage's voice was cut out of the record. We can feel the gaps, the missing Punic histories of the wars, the unwritten biographies of traders who knew both Atlantic storms and Nile floods, the philosophical arguments that might have emerged from a culture sitting between Greek, African, and Levantine worlds. Archaeology, for all its limits, lets us at least sense the outline of those absences. Each foundation trench traced, each inscription cleaned, each layer dated is a small act against the idea that Rome's version is the only version. You might think of it as a second contest over Carthage, long after the first one ended. Not a war of legions, but a slow, careful disagreement about whose memories get to define the past. In that sense, the fall of Carthage is not just an episode of ancient military history. It is a case study in how power tries to control not only territory, but time. How victors reach backward to tidy up the story of their victory. How the defeated can be made to disappear twice, first in stone and flesh, and then in the stories other people tell about them. Some traces resist. A borrowed farming technique in a Roman manual, a Punic word lingering in a North African dialect, a votive inscription to a god whose name was supposed to be forgotten, a layer of rubble beneath a later forum. They are small things, easily overlooked, but together they remind us that no empire, however thorough its conquest, entirely owns the past it inherits. Carthage's fire illuminated Rome's power and Rome's fear. The silence that followed was not natural, it was constructed, and every time we peer past Roman pages into the soil, the shards, the half-legible stones, we loosen that construction a little, making room again for a civilization that others tried, very hard, to burn out of both earth and memory. If you trace the story back from those half-legible stones, it leads you not just to a smoking ruin in 146 BC, but to a shoreline almost 8 centuries earlier. A small Phoenician outpost on the North African coast. Traders from Tyre and Sidon, used to cramped harbours and crowded hillsides, looking out at a wide, gently curving bay and an interior rich in farmland. A peninsula that can be easily fortified. Deep water for anchorage. Offshore islands that make good navigational markers. A place that feels, in the language of later myth, chosen. They sink wells. They plant groves. They lay out streets that will eventually climb toward a hilltop sanctuary. Over time, more ships arrive. Merchants, artisans, farmers. A settlement that once looked back constantly across the sea to its homeland begins to look outward instead. To new routes, new partners, new risks. From that seed, a city grows that will one day rival Rome. From the Roman perspective, Carthage is a problem that keeps coming back, each time larger, more entangled with their own fate. A naval power controlling crucial choke points in the western Mediterranean. A commercial hub whose reach extends from Spanish silver mines to Sicilian grain fields, from Sardinian pastures to perhaps the foggy coasts of the Atlantic. For a long time, rivalry does not mean inevitability. Carthage and Rome coexist. They sign treaties. They fight alongside each other against common enemies. For generations, people on both sides may have assumed this was the way of things. 2 strong powers, each with their own sphere sharing a sea large enough for many ports. The spiral toward catastrophe is gradual. A dispute over a city in Sicily, a series of naval battles, crushing indemnities, a brilliant general who marches elephants over the Alps and spends 15 years turning Italy into a chessboard of ambushes and sieges. A Roman Republic that refuses to accept defeat, that learns from losses, that slowly bends its entire society toward the singular purpose of surviving Hannibal. By the time the Second Punic War ends, the relationship has been transformed. Rome has seen, up close, what Carthaginian leadership and resources can do when fully mobilized. Carthage has been humbled, but not erased. Its fields still grow grain. Its workshops still shape metal and glass. Its ships still move through the harbours, though now under tighter constraints. For some Romans, that is a reason for caution, for negotiated coexistence. For others, it is an intolerable risk. Over the next 50 years, crises on the fringes, Numidian raids, disputed borders, appeals to Roman arbitration add fuel to a fear that never really left after Cannae. Voices like Cato's argue that no treaty, no fine, no limitation will ever be enough. As long as Carthage exists, they say, Rome's safety is incomplete. The Third Punic War is short by the standards of what came before, but its ending is drawn out with deliberate care. A city stripped of its weapons, then of its outlying towns, then of its very walls. A population driven behind improvised barricades, fighting house to house, roof to roof, a last stand on the Bursa Hill, where the survivors cluster around temples and shrines that have anchored the city's life for centuries. And then those 17 days, street by street, building by building, fire by fire, the Roman army unwinds the fabric of Carthage. The flames are not a single blaze, they are many, moving through warehouses stacked with goods, through homes filled with textiles and timber and oil. The heat bakes clay tablets and cracks stone. Roof beams collapse. Air that once carried the smell of spices and sea salt turns to smoke and grit. When we speak of destroying a civilization, the phrase can feel abstract. In Carthage, it was literal work. People had to swing picks, set torches, topple walls. They had to walk streets they had fought through only days earlier and make sure nothing of strategic value remained standing. They pulled down the great harbour works that had sent fleets to Sicily and Spain. They dismantled temples whose gods they had spent generations mistranslating and mistrusting. 17 days is not long in the span of history. It is long enough, though, for the map of the Western Mediterranean to be redrawn. Long enough for a power that had balanced Rome for centuries to vanish as a political actor. Long enough for generations of accumulated knowledge, administrative records, personal letters, philosophical reflections, stories told in Punic script, to be scattered as ash, trampled into the dust, or buried under later construction. Not everything was lost. Some Carthaginians were enslaved and carried across the sea, their skills transplanted into Roman households and estates. Some agricultural techniques survived in Roman manuals under Latin names. Some religious practices persisted in rural sanctuaries, thinly disguised under new labels. The site of the city itself was eventually reoccupied, first awkwardly, then with increasing confidence, as a Roman colony and later a major provincial centre. Walk there centuries after 146, and you would hear Latin in the forums, see Roman baths steaming, watch North African grain loaded onto ships bound for Italian harbours. On the surface, it is a Roman city. Beneath that surface lie Punic foundations, stones reused in new walls, well sunk to depths first measured by earlier hands, street grids that follow in places the logic of older paths. Even in destruction, Carthage proved too useful, too well situated to be abandoned forever. So what, after all of this, is after the ashes? It is not a clean break. It is a palimpsest, layered and rewritten, with traces of the older text still showing through if you angle the light just right. Rome rose higher after Carthage's fall. It became, for a time, the unquestioned hegemon of the Mediterranean. Its roads reached farther, its laws spread wider, its language dug deeper grooves into the memory of Europe and North Africa and beyond. But part of that ascent rests on an absence. On a city that once matched Rome ship for ship, coin for coin, diplomat for diplomat. On a society that sat at the crossroads of continents and wove together ideas and practices from Africa, the Levant, and the wider sea. On a rival so thoroughly defeated that even its story had to be retold by others. When we remember those 17 days now, we're not just tracing the outline of Roman power, we're also acknowledging the cost of that power in human terms, in burned homes, in broken lineages, in unwritten books, in voices we will never hear, and we are, in a quiet way, reversing a small part of what those fires were meant to do. By lingering on Carthage's rise as well as its fall, on its markets and harbours and households as well as its battlefields, by holding in mind both what was destroyed and what can still be recovered from earth and inscription, and careful reconstruction, we refuse to let the city exist only as Rome's vanquished shadow. We allow it, imperfectly, partially, to be itself again. If this journey through Carthage's life and death has stayed with you, if it has given you something to think about as you drift towards sleep, you can help these stories travel a little farther. You can like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And before you close your eyes, tell us one more thing in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from right now as the fires of ancient Carthage fade and the night settles in around you?